The Model T was not a car as we know them now. It was a person, crotchety and mean, frolicsome and full of jokes. Just when you were ready to kill yourself, it would run 5 miles with no gasoline whatsoever. I understood it, but as I said before, it understood me. It magnified some of my faults, corrected others. It worked on the sin of impatience. It destroyed the sin of vanity. And it helped establish an almost Oriental philosophy of acceptance. So were the words of American author John Steinbeck, published in 1953 in the Ford News, about the passing of the Model T as the end of American innocence. Henry Ford, founder, engineer, and leader of Ford Motor Company, had brought not only America the notion of an affordable, practical means of motorized transport, but the entire world. He embodied much of what America strove to be in the 19th and early parts of the 20th century: independent, forthright, and self-made. His company, like his cars, became showpieces of the American middle class, offering an alternative to vast income disparities and luxury goods for the few, with concepts such as the $5 workday and simple, low-priced vehicles his own workers could afford. As Henry Ford neared the end of his life in 1947, however, he saw in America much changed from his youthful days as a farm boy, with a vast centralization of power brought about by 2 world wars, and a technocratic elite coming to dominate society from within institutions like the major corporations that he in part helped create.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
Ich bin ein Tier.
Na pełni rozglądności захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we are going to be talking about Henry Ford, his life, his work, and his legacy. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Alex Walker. Say hello, please.
Hello.
And my co-hosts, Hans Lander.
Hey, everyone.
And Nick Mason.
Hello.
So, guys, before we get into Ford's early life and his beginnings, I just wanted to kind of start with a quick question. When you hear the name Henry Ford, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
The Ford GT.
Hans, Alex?
The assembly line.
The International Jew.
I think of a picture of him standing in front of his Model T. That's his probably the car that made him successful.
Yeah.
But with that, Hans, can you tell us a little bit about Henry Ford's early life?
So Henry Ford was born in 1863 in a small farm in Michigan. His father, William Ford, immigrated from Ireland, but is actually a member of a English family, a working class English family. And his mother, Mary Littlegoat, was a Belgian immigrant to the United States, or the descendants of Belgian immigrants. Both of them were really just farmhands. They were very modest people. They were devout Protestants. His father was an Episcopalian when he moved to the United States. And they raised Henry with this sort of farmhand Episcopalian ethic. He attended a one-room school. This is really just after America has started to get a functioning public education system, and it's mostly just small farmhouse schools that are one room. They teach the very, very basic elements of mathematics, English, so on. When he was very young, he hated farm work. He preferred to take apart watches, and he kept a small journal or notebook where he would write down basic schematics for a steam engine or a water-driven wheel or something like that. And so he hated this idea of manual farm labor, as you do when you're a young child. No one really likes it, and he loved taking things apart. And his father noticed this very quickly. So William Ford at one point told family, my son is only interested in mechanics. It's all he wants to learn about. It's all he wants to know about. Henry was not too interested in the social sciences or history or basic English. In a way, he was a true sort of applied mechanic, in that he only ever wanted to learn the basics and then the advanced elements of what was the early onset Industrial Revolution. At this point, Michigan and the Great Lakes area was only starting to have this influx of manufacturing. Keep in mind that at the time, New England was really the center of American manufacturing, particularly as the South, what little manufacturing it had was being destroyed in the Civil War. And because of this immense devotion to something that seemed so far away that he could only ever sort of grasp in small schematics he would find, or blueprints, or things he would read, or that his father would tell him, it was always this dream to enter the world of mechanics that drove him, I think, to try as hard as he did and never or keep persisting. So he goes through school, and when he is 16, he leaves with what's effectively a sixth grade education. As we'll see later in his life, this kind of comes back to haunt him, this idea that he's not sophisticated, he's not properly educated. And
it's worth saying, though, that a sixth grade education in Ford's time is probably superior to a college education in our time.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. And despite having this sixth grade education that he was so chided for later in life, he commanded the English language incredibly well, and he commanded mathematics also incredibly well, and applied physics and chemistry and so on. He was, I think part of it was a born gift, but I think part of it was his devotion to certain subjects that interested him and a complete dismissal of things that really didn't. He once said he wasn't interested so much in the history of America as he was interested in the history of the common man, the common American man. So he leaves his small farming town to head to Detroit, to live outside Detroit with an aunt, to get a job as an early machinist. And he walked 9 miles a day as a 16-year-old to go to work 6 days a week. When he was a couple years older, he found a working steam engine from a neighbor. And in his spare time, when he wasn't working in various machine shops gaining basic skills, he disassembled and documented every piece of the steam engine, this old steam engine, and wanted to understand how it worked at the most fundamental physical level. When he was older, he started working on repairing steam engines and then demonstrating them to potential customers for Westinghouse. And then not long after that, he enrolled in business school. He enrolled in Goldsmith, Bryant, and Stratton Business University. Now, he only takes a few basic classes in just sort of the entry levels of entrepreneurship, accounting, finance, management, so on. And he never really gets, I don't think he really ever completes a full degree. It's not a complete business education. And it was really only what he thought he needed to know in order to take his mechanical skills and apply them to the business world.
Now, Hans, Was Westinghouse called the Edison Illuminating Company at the time?
I believe so.
Yeah, because Henry Ford was a huge fan of Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was sort of
He was his mentor.
Steve Jobs of the day. I mean, trying to find an analogy to Thomas Edison is almost difficult because he was one of a kind, but he had run Menlo Park, the research center in the East Coast, not the one in California, with thousands upon thousands of patents, most of which were not his own creations, but he just essentially was signing them when they were submitted to the patent office. But he was responsible directly for quite a few inventions, obviously the incandescent light bulb, and I think the phonograph, the voice recorder. There was just an immense genius to the man. And so, of course, Henry Ford, being somewhat of an inventor himself, admired him greatly. And he was actually able to meet with him early in his life when Ford was a nobody, relatively speaking. And I think it was just a chance encounter. But from then on, he had become very inspired by the man. He set out to do his own inventing. And then later in life, they actually became very good friends. And one other comment I'd like to make about the tinkering nature of Henry Ford, he was actually very fortunate to have a father and mother that were indulgent in his hobbies. He was allowed to basically skip a lot of the basic farm work and chores that was expected of, I think he was the eldest son of the family, and he was spending that time, taking things apart and trying to arrange them in a more efficient way. And without that sort of opportunity, he may not have been able to achieve what he did later on in life. So all these little circumstances are very interesting in how they shape a man's life.
It's also noteworthy with respect to Thomas Edison that in 1915, Ford went to the West Coast to attend a race betterment conference in San Francisco. The speakers at which included Luther Burbank, who's a plant breeder, Charles Eliot, president of Harvard, and Thomas Edison, as well as John Harvey Kellogg of the cereal company and Harvey Firestone of the tire company. Edison himself had pretty moderate views on the Jews, but he had views on the Jews that also would not be acceptable today.
In San Francisco, no less.
It's eugenics conference, effectively. Yeah. I mean, he was also Ford, and we'll get into this later, but Ford was immensely influenced by the first president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, who was a eugenicist, and he was also a pacifist for racialist purposes. And he had similar views of. We'll get into World War I later. I mean, Ford was effectively one of the main leaders of the anti-war movement during World War I. And Jordan, the context for this, Jordan's influence, Jordan viewed that it was international finance, largely Jewish banking firms, such as the Rothschilds, that were responsible for leading Europe to war. And when you read the works of people critical of Ford, or rather who are libelous of Ford or out to get him and defame him in various ways, they point towards these kinds of relationships to indicate that he was, a eugenicist and an anti-Semite. The truth of which is somewhat murky. We will get into later. So eugenicist, though, I would say yes, like unquestionably.
Yeah, but for all people, from what I can tell.
Ford was not. Well, we can say now, Ford was not a racialist, as is commonly thought of today. He was in favor of a sort of. He was, maybe you might say, like a culturist. It's kind of a gay word, but like he was an assimilationist, and he believed that. I mean, he was definitely on board with things like the 1924 Act restricting immigration, and he felt that immigration was too much of a problem, and in particular Jewish immigration was an issue. But this, from his perspective, his more of his worldview on this was that, well, you need to assimilate to the cultural norms, and if you're not doing this, this is a problem, and we need to look at this problem. It wasn't so much the same as the views of maybe Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant, who were racialists of the era.
Hans, why don't you pick up where you left off there? So
Sure.
He was at the Edison Illuminating Company, and
Yes.
he makes his way to Detroit.
Yeah. And by the time he's 31, he's actually the chief engineer of the Edison Illuminating Company. And by this point, he had a strong friendship with Thomas Edison and was learning a great deal, not just about sort of the new age of electrical engineering and I would say like the second or third American Industrial Revolution, but also business strategy. Like you said earlier, Thomas Edison was so much he was a great inventor and engineer, but he was much, much better in the way Steve Jobs was at business strategy and at acquiring assets needed in order to create the best business possible and collect as many patents as possible.
Well, perhaps like Steve Jobs, he was also a bit of a showman. There's a very famous case where he was an advocate for direct current versus alternating current. And I believe it was in New York City where they staged this mass electrocution of horses where they flipped the switch on alternating current and managed to kill all these horses in Times Square or somewhere, whereas his DC current, of course, was the much safer alternative, which in reality is bullshit. There's really no lethal difference in my knowledge, and the efficiency gains of alternating current are actually pretty tremendous. But nonetheless, he staged this sort of thing, and he had that kind of business ruthlessness that is often skipped over when people look at these great inventors that became famous later on. And they forget, a lot of it had to do with their willingness to crush people, compared to people like Nikola Tesla, who was much more scientific in his approach, and he wouldn't indulge in this sort of nonsense marketing techniques that Edison seemed to like. And some people have accused Steve Jobs of the same thing. But anyway, that's a little bit off topic. I just wanted to put a little context around Thomas Edison, and also at some point I'd like to bring up what Henry Ford's personality was like as it pertains to business and how he approached it versus somebody like a Wall Street banker would.
Right.
Somebody like a Jew would.
Or a JP Morgan, in all fairness. Anybody who's big money. But yeah, we know who that is. Overrepresentative these days.
So in 1896, Henry Ford develops what is effectively a mechanized carriage. I think this is really the quadricycle. And he drives it to Detroit for the first time. Now, this machine had a top speed of 20 miles per hour, could effectively go in reverse. But one of the pitfalls is that it couldn't do any of these things for extended periods of time and overheated very rapidly.
Did he made it to Detroit? He took it off from Dearborn to Detroit?
Yeah, he's in Detroit.
How far is that? You guys
it's pretty close. It's like the next city over.
Okay. And populated by kebab today, is that right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Dearborn
it's one of the major populations, but
sad.
So in 1899, Henry, with some investors, as you would later call them, vultures, 9 of them, including a man named Malcolmson, who led this sort of speculative group, back Henry to create the Detroit Automobile Company. By this time, there's already a great kind of flourishing of this particular industrial sector in the Great Lakes region, especially in Upper Michigan. There's about 57 firms of this same type founded that same year, and then within 2 years, there's over 100.
Yeah, just very briefly, the sort of Detroit of the time was the Silicon Valley of the United States.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the sort of reason why one can speculate as to the reasons, but one of the reasons Detroit and the Great Lakes were becoming such a amazing place to set up manufacturing was obviously the tremendous water access that those cities had. Now, that was not necessarily useful prior to the Erie Dam opening, the Erie Canal opening. But what that did was it connected Lake Erie to the Atlantic Ocean through upstate New York, and so that opened up the Midwest to the East Coast and then Europe, essentially. And when that happened, it was the raw materials of places like Upper Michigan, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and the Great Lakes region as a whole, with all the iron ore deposits and the timber that were very easily exploited by moving them across the lakes and then down to regions like Detroit and Chicago, where they could be put on railroads or put onto over the series of lakes to the canal to the East Coast, which I think helped the Great Lakes regions become such an important manufacturing center for the United States for the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 19th century.
Right. And like you mentioned Silicon Valley. This is sort of what happened with the kind of explosion of semiconductor firms after the Traitorous Eight abandoned Robert Shockley, I believe. And within a couple of years, it was almost an exponential growth of these small semiconductor machine shops in what was an area that was really just orange orchards for most of its developed history.
Well, that had a parallel in Detroit as well, as I'm
Yeah.
sure where you're going.
Yeah. So this company doesn't last long. Their first model that they produce, bad carbonator, bad engine, bad design, barely worked, broke down constantly, was not easy to repair. Big pitfall was he was too reliant on too many other producers of various components, and the supply chain never worked out in a profitable way. And it was abandoned. He abandoned it. And in 1901, he comes back. He doesn't give up. And he builds what's effectively a race car and participates in Michigan's first automobile race, and then wins the race using this car and makes a huge name for himself and attracts new investors. And in 1903, he builds and incorporates the Ford Motor Company. And this is where the Dodge brothers and other investors come on the scene again to prop up Henry Ford as the man behind the curtain and also sort of the chief engineer of the company. And then this eventually falls away. I'm sorry. And he starts selling his first cars, the Model A, which is $850. And $850 in mid 1903 is very expensive. This sort of reinforced this idea that the cars are only for the wealthy, but it wasn't too expensive for people like traveling doctors or salesmen to save up in a Ford, which is which is kind of Ford's intention for building out the automobile, was in a way giving opportunity to what he saw as the working heart of America, particularly the farmers.
So, just to clarify, there are two Model A's. Hans is referring to the first one from 1903 to 2004.
Yeah.
I'd also like to bring up in the Detroit Automobile Company, his sort of fighting with the bankers. Basically, he was financed with other people's money, and he was put in charge of kind of the the engineering, which I'd also like to make a few comments about. But what he learned from this, and I think he talks about it in one of his autobiographies, is just how difficult it is dealing with money men versus people who are more product oriented. He's basically a product guy. He likes to create products that are useful to people rather than make money. That was his main concern about bringing wheels to the world, is the title of one of the books I read, rather than let's make a lot of money. And he was having difficulties dealing with the bankers when they were having product setbacks and sales setbacks where he wanted to spend the time to make the product right, and he just couldn't handle these people. And so I don't remember exactly how he structured it differently in the Ford Motor Company, but I think he made provisions to keep his control stronger in that situation. Alex, do you want to comment, please?
Sure. I that's right. We saw the first conflict between Ford's approach of focusing on the work itself, in particular cost to the consumer and reliability. He was a real perfectionist when it came to his products, and he would delay release as long as he wasn't ready to release a car until he felt that people could rely on it. And his backers wanted, they wanted a return fast. They wanted to do what others were doing at the time, which was turn out a high-cost automobile. Reliability be damned, because, well, if you can come back and sell the guy parts at a nice profit, well, then that's good business too. There was a bit of deception there, it seemed. He, at one point, faked work on this luxury car that he was supposed to be building, while actually continuing to develop the kind of car that he wanted. So he deceived his investors at one point. And that company did go on. It actually became, in some form, it went on and became the Cadillac company.
That's right. So I think that in a lot of ways, to Alex's point, Ford was not interested in treating his company like Wonder Bread, just selling products as fast as possible for people to consume, break down, and then come back for the next round as soon as possible. He was much more focused on delivering something to people that would improve their lives in the long term and would create circumstances that would allow them to also gain skills repairing their own vehicles if need be. I think that he really is sort of this Adam Smithian ideal capitalist or industrialist who would develop products in the best way possible to improve the quality of his nation. And none of the people who worked with him really enjoyed this approach. He had incredible turnover, not just in his assembly line workers or just his laborers, but his engineers, designers, and his backers, all in a lot of ways disliked him on a personal level because he was too dogmatic, and he was often even accused of being a socialist almost for insisting that the work that they would do, the production that they would undertake, would benefit the United States of America.
I hadn't heard that. Are you talking about his business backers, or are you talking about the factory people?
Both.
Okay, I can add some nuance to that, but keep going. I'll let you finish, please.
Well, I would just add, he's in many ways the exception that proves the rule with respect to capitalism not being Adam Smith's ideal. Not Adam Smith, but the Scottish one.
Yeah. So he starts blowing through every letter of the alphabet with new models. So A, B through C, so on. Each of them, something wrong. And he trashes it. I said, okay, this is not right. There's some flaw here. There's some flaw there. Breaks down too often. The carbonator's not good enough. Whatever the case. And he goes through this for several years. In like 1907, he kind of expands, starts developing tractors and other things to help the average farmer, because in his mind, they're not developing the sort of end-all, sturdy, all-purpose Swiss Army knife vehicle that he wanted, that he had conceptualized in his mind for years. And in later 1907, he starts plans on what became the Model T. Next year, moves to Highland Park, which became the largest factory ever built at the time. And in late 1908, Ford releases the Model T. So the Model T became sort of the standard, the benchmark for the American automobile. It had a 4-cylinder, 4 horsepower engine with a magnetic generator, so a magnetron or a magneto, I think it was called, these cylinders, that powered the ignition and the lights. And then it had an open top with an optional cover. And the only colors ever offered for this vehicle were jet black. And then later he introduced a green version. But in his mind, Ford only ever wanted this jet black, all-purpose, sturdy vehicle that you could use on Madison Avenue in New York City with, say, like the Rockefeller types, or you could use in a backwoods farm out in the Appalachians. And in either case, it would work exceptionally well. Now, it weighed like 1,200 pounds, could go up to about 40 miles per hour, and was broken down into about 1,200 independent pieces. The thing that really attracted people to it was that the component parts and the fixes were relatively easy. It broke down almost never, especially compared to the other models competing with it at the time. And his primary market, when he priced it at $850 and then allowed the price to quickly drop, were farmers, traveling salesmen, machinists, soldiers, artisans, doctors, so on. Ford effectively believed that if you empowered the average American with the automobile, especially with one that they could easily fix and could afford to even replace if necessary, that you would empower the whole country, right? Because at the time, America was really only, I should say, had very poor infrastructure investment. The best thing the United States had were extensive railroad networks and maybe some roads that were well maintained inside major urban areas, but even that was rare. Often, they were covered in horse shit from carriages, and they were constantly falling apart. And when he priced the vehicle so low and allowed it to then drop shortly thereafter, he knew that this would then spur governments and spur private organizations in the United States to develop American infrastructure, which he thought was the thing holding the yeoman farmers like his father back from achieving something greater and from having greater potential.
Because at the time, the roads that did exist were almost entirely private, were they not?
Yeah. The U.S. was the late 19th century was the Lulberg utopia, and Henry Ford decided to change that. Yeah.
So, a couple things about the Model T. Probably Henry Ford's biggest innovation, frankly, and the way he went about constructing it was also one of his biggest innovations. The sales figures for the Model T, just to compare how dominant the Ford Motor Company was at the time compared to its chief rival General Motors, which was still smaller than Ford, which today is reversed. But the sales figures around 1920 were 900,000 per year versus Chevrolet's 61,000. And the main reason I think the Model T was so popular was the market wasn't saturated, first of all, so nobody really had a car. And so if they're going to choose a car and they're not exactly... The middle class really was almost another Ford innovation. So the middle class didn't exactly exist. A lot of people were just basic farmers. They didn't have a lot of income. They were probably somewhat subsistence in nature. And so whatever discretionary funds they did have, they had to spend it very carefully. Another thing about Ford was that he didn't really indulge people with financing versus General Motors, which actually had a very large division in New York based around the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, which was predominantly focused on loaning people money to buy cars. But at the time, the Model T just really had no equal. It was so cheap that people could buy it, and no company had ever figured out how to do this scale of production at such a low cost. And that was probably Henry Ford's most second famous contribution to the world, was his introduction, or his mass introduction of the assembly line, which he actually borrowed from, I believe, a meatpacking plant in Chicago or somewhere thereabouts, where he saw how the meat was actually hanging from these moving hooks, and the workers would actually process it as it moved down the line, rather than them traveling on their own feet. But they would actually have the work brought to them, and then each station would be set up along the way. He applied that concept to Highland Park, where he was actually operating out of Detroit. Later on, when they built the Rouge, which is in Dearborn, that became the largest manufacturing facility in the world. And to this day, it is one of the largest. It may not be the largest, but it is a tremendous facility. And the Model T was the main product of Ford for almost 20 years. I mean, that's all they made. And when General Motors actually did start eating away at Ford, one of the reasons was they were actually creating new types of cars. They were segmenting the market. They were creating different categories for different buyers, rather than one size fits all. And the famous joke about Ford was you can have a Model T in any color you want as long as it's black. And so that was the sort of ethos that Henry Ford was applying. It was all about bringing the cost down, bringing that car to that poor farmer that didn't have anything. But I think over time, once people started owning cars, they got a taste for what that was like. They started thinking about, well, what's next? And the Model T was really all that Ford had up until they were forced to change their model. And that's when they created the second Model A. But Hans, you're doing a good job with the summary, so do you want to keep going?
Yeah, he, I think that before we get too much into, I think, Fordism and the manufacturing breakthroughs, one of the things that Ford was most known for, particularly on the Model T, was almost a perfect understanding of everything that made that vehicle tick and how it worked. And this kind of feeds into why he's so intransigent later in life and is, combative with his son at still Ford about expanding to new product lines within the Ford Motor Company. He once remarked to someone that he knew precisely that it took 7,882 single movements to construct a Ford Model T. And he knew these figures off the top of his head. He had it down to a science, the exact amount of cost it was per movement, per worker under optimal conditions and also under suboptimal conditions. Everything that was the Model T was sort of the life of Henry Ford in a lot of ways, was this perfect product that he thought he had crafted. And it wasn't so much about, his life was not about, trying to do like these corporate takeovers or he expanded into everything, although he kind of did that later. It was more about, I'm going to perfect this product that I think will serve the American people. And that's what my role in society is. It's to make this thing work as best as possible for people.
Have you guys heard of
Very
Taylorism?
social national ethos.
Yes, I've heard of Taylorism.
Yeah, scientific management. I think Henry
Yeah.
Ford is probably the biggest embodiment of this philosophy of essentially doing time and motion studies on every manufacturing operation imaginable, and he had 7,000 of these operations in his head apparently. But this had a very, and this is part of mass production and the assembly line concepts. But this, Alex, I'm hearing my voice. Could you?
Oh, he also broke down which of those motions could be done by an able-bodied man, a strong able-bodied man, a one-armed man, a man with no hands, a blind man. Actually, at one point, injured workers. He would bring injured workers back in sooner than other companies. There's a story about how men who had serious injuries like fractures would be brought. He created this room, like a hospital room in the factory, where he assigned this light task to guys to do in bed, just like screwing a nut onto a bolt, something like that. And he found that these men ended up being more efficient at the task than the able-bodied men on the line.
Interesting.
I guess it would be because it's the only thing to occupy them, so all their focus is dedicated towards it. Is that probably the reason?
Yeah.
Yeah, they probably had something to prove. They wanted to prove their worth.
Right.
He would pay. He wouldn't fire somebody when they got injured. He would keep them on the payroll, but I guess at a reduced rate. And these men wanted to come. They wanted to come back and work, and so he found a way.
Did he engender affection in his employees? Worth noting.
Yeah.
Well, see that you said before, Hans, that he didn't get along with people, and I don't know if that's completely true. I think he did have a personality that was very difficult to understand. He was a very unique person. He was very obsessed with obviously what he was doing, and most people don't carry that.
Geniuses always are.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't really bring that type of passion to the workplace. But in fairness to them, if their name isn't on the building, I wouldn't really either. I mean, it's not theirs, and so the sense of ownership was not exactly theirs. Right. James Cameron, one of my favorite directors, he gets accused of the same sort of personality, in that he is really vicious with people on set. Obviously, the quality of his work is outstanding, but some of the people actually appreciate his perfectionism, but other people hate his guts because he essentially will crush you if you don't do it exactly the way he wants it. And I don't know if Henry Ford is exactly that way, but what I've read is that he was extremely good at inspiring some of his, especially in the early days, some of the workmen in the workshop, at least, when they were tinkering, when it wasn't this mass production operation, at least, where people were actually having an opportunity to contribute their own thoughts to how to put together an engine.
Right. He took into account, he not all these improvements in the process came directly from Ford. In his autobiography, he talks about how he was impressed by the Polish workers' ability to make little improvements to their part of the process. One other thing about his organizational philosophy is that he hated titles. He wouldn't give titles to his to his managers. He said a man would become his title. So he would take them on, and then he made it sound as though he let them find where they could be most useful. So there was a bit of fluidity in the factory. People could move to where they felt that they could contribute the most.
Interesting. Yeah, he had a very I'll get more into this with the manufacturing stuff, but he had a very Prussian notion of meritocracy, of meritocratic administrative units. in that there's some fluidity between administrative units based on meritocratic principles and fine-tuning the organization to how people best interact within the organization and so on. And then on really quickly on the subject of James Cameron, I remember hearing once that he on the set of Avatar, he had an employee while they were filming. Their phone went off and it made noise. James Cameron yelled, "Cut!" Stopped filming. Walked over to the employee, yanked the phone out of his hand, took a nail gun, and shot a nail through the phone into the wall, and told the guy, "You're fired." And then in a similar circumstance, Henry Ford, he was on a trip to Europe, and when he came back, he discovered that some of his designers and engineers had developed a new car, a new prototype, while he was gone. Without necessarily telling him, they just thought to do it. And the first thing he did upon seeing it was yank the doors off, kick the tires out, pretty much did everything to destroy the car right in front of them, and didn't say a word. And the message was clear: I'm going to invent things. I'm going to design things. This is the Ford Motor Company. This is not your motor company.
After the decline of Henry Ford's health in his later years, when he started bringing in other managers, and obviously after he died, the lack of actual administrative organization was very apparent to a lot of people. And right. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that he really was a kid in his own candy store, and he basically wouldn't allow anybody in to operate through a bureaucracy, which is what General Motors essentially did. And a lot of people have sort of accused Ford of not being a very good administrator, obviously being a very good production guy, but he had no mind for people in the sense that they needed to have a broader compartmentalization so that the organization could scale. I mean, his approach was very good at a small level when he could actually keep track of everything. But as the organization grows, and especially after the Model T's introduction and the construction of all those factories, there just are limits to scale and limits to how much one man can do. And it really depended on his ability to keep up with things. And I think the organization suffered as a result as it grew because of its dependency on that one man.
He was the linchpin of that company. And I think of the industry. There's a small story where he fought in federal court, to take out what was the 1879 Selden patent, which was this really obscure patent that had been filed that claimed some kind of right to all vehicles powered by internal combustion engines. And when he destroyed this patent, he was lauded by many of his competitors in the industry because they no longer had to pay royalties.
Yeah, but by the way, before he did that, they were all, well, most of them at least, were willing to just settle out of court because they just didn't want to take this guy on. Yeah. And he just was fighting it, I think, almost on principle, because he just found that this obscure former Eastman, or soon to be Eastman Kodak, but basically the cameraman's company, this is where the patent came from. A guy who worked there, Selden, and he was fired by Eastman for not being aggressive enough. So you have this literal patent troll guy who's too meek to really do anything in the real world, and he just writes on a piece of paper his idea about a car with wheels that moves down a road, and he starts suing people. And I've heard stories from people that have actually run into the patent trolls, and essentially it's this really, it feels like you're being held up, for ransom. It feels like a guy who's pointing a gun at you as you stop at a traffic light suddenly appears and asks for your wallet. This man really contributed very little, and I think Ford was reacting out of emotion and a sense of righteousness when he took this guy on, and nobody else would do it. And I think he won, and it brought a lot of fame and positive publicity to the Ford Motor Company, because it looked like this guy was actually standing up for the people who are industrious in the society versus somebody who's just out to make a buck.
Well, and I want to get Alex's take on this too, but I think that while we're on the subject, Henry Ford would look down deeply on people like Steve Jobs for patent trolling, and particularly Apple, which has sort of become the modern day Ford Motor Company for the United States. It survives in a sense off of patent trolling. Steve Jobs is infamous for going to trade shows and walking up to people, asking them about their invention and saying, I'll be seeing you in court real soon.
Yeah,
over
fuck that.
the silliest things. And I don't know, Alex, if you think that, or if you agree with that Ford would hate many of the industrialists.
Well, real quick, I remember like there was a suit with Samsung 4 or 5 years ago between Apple and them, and it was over a broad set of patent claims, but one of them was really ridiculous. It was, and I think Apple won, but one of the claims was just out of this world. It was something to do with like rounded corners on icons or something absurd like that, you know. And it's almost like Amazon's one-click patent for shopping carts. Just this level of ridiculousness where the government is essentially enforcing a monopoly on one company's business, not even an idea, in my opinion. I mean, the true definition of a patent just has to be original and non-obvious. And a rounded corner is not an innovation, but you get the idea.
Yeah. Alex, do you have a take on this?
Yeah, I don't think that Ford approached his enterprise once it was up and running from the same kind of profit-oriented or return on investment oriented perspective. I mean, just look at how he thought of. He thought that the car should last forever. He didn't come out with a new model every year.
No planned obsolescence.
No planned obsolescence, that's right. And he wanted parts from new Model Ts to work on old Model Ts. In fact, he thought that could go on forever. Look at how Apple prices its accessories. You know, a MacBook's charger breaks after, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years, and then they charge you, what, $70 for a new one? Ford would never do that.
Yeah.
But he and Jobs did have that same, maniacal sense of control. But I don't think there's any way around that. I think that's what you need to build an enterprise like this. Something that's, it's huge, it's complex, and it's new. Both of these men knew what they wanted to create, and they believed that those products, the iPhone and the Model T, were what people needed.
Most artists are not beholden to some kind of large production machinery. I mean, most artists are independent individual people, and they don't have to deal with that. It's funny because Adam, I believe, was mentioning directors earlier, and directors are the more. I mean, there would be some, I guess, debate over whether or not people would call Henry Ford an artist, but I would. But someone like a director is a good example where no one would dispute that they're involved in artistic creative activity, but they do run a many-man team with many moving parts, and they have to deal with things like management. And a lot of famous directors like Cameron or notoriously Kubrick ran into some very serious personal conflicts over that, or Sam Peckinpah. Part of that was drugs, but tangent. Point being is that, like, those skills, the skills that turn you, the skills and natural gifts that can make you a genius inventor, don't always translate, and often are at cross paths with the kinds of skills that Adam is referring to, managerial skills, interpersonal skills. They don't always complement each other and are frequently getting in the way of each other.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the only reason Henry Ford, well, one of the reasons he lasted so long was that he was kind of part of the brand. I mean, people really, I think, respected him. And when they bought a Ford, they were buying, Henry Ford's car.
Well, that, and he was, from what I'm, what you guys are saying, I mean, he was constantly coming out with new ideas too. Like he always remained on the cutting edge.
He truly was an innovative manufacturer. Whether he was a product genius, is somewhat debatable, because his obsession with the Model T obviously shows that what his main goal was more philosophical, and that he wanted to bring, I'll bring it up again, the title of this book, Wheels to the World, which he then later kind of had some second thoughts about. As the industrial world started looking very different from what he grew up with. But his mission, and maybe we can talk about Fordism a little bit, was to create a opportunity for people to afford his own products through the type of work that his company was providing. And it was the $5 a day concept that really brought him a lot of fame and brought a lot of unnecessary workers to Detroit, actually. But it was just I think it was a doubling of the wage rates, and all of his financiers just threw their pencils and paper at him when he declared this one day. And again, it's like only the founder of a company could get away with something like this. No CEO, MBA guy who got hired out of some business school is ever going to be able to pull this off, because he just doesn't have that political aura around him. But it takes a founder to pull something like this off, and it truly was like this kind of almost socialistic, communistic approach to viewing the workers as a family rather than these units of economic output. And
I wouldn't wouldn't conflate communism and socialism there. I would say it's definitely socialistic, but it does not follow that it's communistic.
Okay. My main point was it was not capitalistic, and that it was
I get it. And I agree with you very much. I just would emphasize that socialism does not equal communism.
Sure, I agree.
I would say that in some ways and we'll distinguish between Fordism as economic, macroeconomic policy, and Fordism as organization, or as organizational theory and process engineering. But what Ford was really trying to do is almost like this ideal form of feudalism, or the proto-capitalism that Adam Smith imagined, where you have this moralistic code that's sort of unspoken, along with the invisible hand of the market at work, which Ford, in a lot of ways, tried to perfect. He didn't want to use the government against his competitors the way that Jobs did. In fact, he fought the government to create a free market by removing patents and intellectual property law as much as possible, and then tried to see if he could outcompete everyone in the market.
Yeah, in many ways, like what Elon Musk did a few years ago when he released all the Tesla Motors patents onto the marketplace to encourage adoption of electric vehicles in the broader market.
Right. And I would say that it's sort of feudalism, because he sees his workers as needing to
perhaps paternalism is what you mean? Maybe
paternalism, yeah. He sees his workers as having to ascend to some sort of higher level of workmanship, of character, of class, and so on. And of course, he tried to encapsulate his feudal empire, particularly his manufacturing complexes, as much as possible from the outside world. And we'll get to that with some of the innovations at Highland Park, and then a lot of them at River Rouge plant.
There was just to illustrate his paternalistic way of of running his business, there was a factory town he built in Brazil called Fordlandia, and it was a complete vertically integrated operation in the sense that the town had housing, it had a company store, and I think it was a rubber plantation. Main reason why it was in Brazil, I think, and the buildings are still there. You can go see them. They're no longer in use, but it's somewhere in the jungle, I think, and it was on the river so that they could export the product out to the ocean. And the concepts of paternalism were very clear in that you could find like a dance hall there where people were encouraged to recreate in a very sort of prudish but modest way with a particular type of dance. They probably had a band that was trained in a particular type of music, and liquor was discouraged. Getting up on time, going to bed early was encouraged. I mean, just really all these like kind of very almost Puritan-like habits that he tried to instill in his workers to try to raise the quality of the person beyond the actual confines of the workplace. He really tried to include the entire lifestyle into one cohesive unit.
Correct.
That's right. He had they formed a sociological department at in the U.S. and they had a team of inspectors that would go around to employees' homes to look for evidence of. In particular, he was concerned with immigrants. He employed a lot of Eastern Europeans. He was concerned with drinking, smoking, keeping boarders apparently was a problem, deadbeat fathers. So he had these inspectors go around and check up on his employees. One violation would result in the withholding of employee bonuses. The $5 a day wage and then the $6 a day wage was not guaranteed. The original wage was about half of that, but it's my understanding that the full $5 or $6 would only be paid out at the end of the year. Is this and that was dependent on passing inspection, and the pass rate went way up. It started out at about 60 or 70%, and then was well into the 90s by after a few months.
Well, just to go back to the $5 a day and just how profound this was, according to a Ford worker, Logan Miller, in January 1914, it was announced that Ford was going to pay a minimum wage of $5 a day. At that time, I was getting 32 cents an hour, and this new Ford wage equivalent was 62.5 cents an hour. So that's a doubling, and people were absolutely stunned by it.
Yeah,
almost a doubling.
He also had like a profit sharing component, I believe, for workers in Ford's mind, and this kind of bleeds into the Fordism as macroeconomic and then sort of microeconomic policy, that if you empower people with purchasing power, you will thus empower your business, not only because you incentivize their employees to buy your products, but because you then set a sort of benchmark for the manufacturing industry as a whole to attract the best workers, and then other companies also raise their wages, and you have systemic wide change that improves the lives of Americans all over the country. So this is really the beginnings of Fordism as it comes into the world. So there's four dimensions to Fordism. Of course, there's the industrial paradigm, which is process engineering and so on. There's mass production and mass consumption. There's regulation, and then there's also social life. So Ford effectively wanted to create this massive production and consumption system with a freer market. He went after government regulation, went after intellectual property rights, and thought the best way to help the American workers. And again, this is despite being accused of socialism and a proponent of socialism his whole life. Fundamentally believed the best way to improve Americans was through the private sector, out of a paternalistic sense of giving back to the people of the country. And this goes, again, back to what he said. He was only ever interested in the history of the common man. He was never interested really in the history of the United States.
You mentioned giving back. There's one story about how he actually gave back $50 of the purchase price of the car to people who had already bought the car after he lowered the price, but then he went back and gave people back what they'd overpaid in his mind, rather than giving out a dividend.
Right.
I mean, who could imagine a business doing this today?
Oh my God, no.
It just doesn't exist.
I mean, so Mike Enoch actually a couple of years ago at TRS, they used to talk about this a lot, swivel down economics, and it's this basic industrial theory. If you've gone to business school, you've heard of this, where it's certain high-priced items that are sort of luxury goods, the microwave, high-def TV, stereo, so on, are priced abnormally high when they're first released, and then as their manufacturing processes become cheaper, they're more fine-tuned, so on, people buy more of them, then the demand also shifts towards more people buying them, prices go down, so on.
It's also a way of capturing the opportunities of people willing to pay more. And I mean, the basic concept is, if there's somebody willing to pay $100, but you're only charging $50, you're only going to get $50 out of him. But if you started at 100 and then gradually move down to capture the people that didn't buy it yet because they're not willing to pay 100, you can get both of those customers with $100 and $50, so the total being $150 versus before you'd only get $100 if you priced it at the bottom at the beginning.
Yeah. And I hadn't heard of that, Alex, that he actually gave back sort of a rebate almost. And then another thing he did was he developed hospitals, he gave land for gardens, he did all sorts of stuff in the Detroit metro area and then in other areas of Michigan, just to ensure that his workers had access to the basic amenities of life, along with trying to improve their social standing with the Ford Sociological Department.
Now, I'd like to sort of ask you guys, what do you think his motivations were with the $5 a day? Because there were people like Ida Tarbell who had written about the Standard Oil Company, John Rockefeller's operation, in a very critical way about these kind of very large industrial companies who were sort of forces for bad in kind of her writing. And she was walking around, Detroit one day, and I think Henry Ford caught wind of this, and this may have affected his decision making about announcing this $5. But what do you think the reasons were in his head for doing that? Do you think he was trying to stave off unionism, or do you think he was just trying to do what he later claimed to do, which was give his workers an opportunity to buy the products? There's many explanations given, but I'd like to hear what you guys think.
So, go ahead, Alex.
Well, worker retainment was a big factor in the plant. I mean, this was repetitive work, and so he had to, paying the market wage. His worker turnover was extremely high, which was costly, and so he felt that it actually improved profitability. I mean, his
I read somewhere it was 25% a year, roughly.
That sounds right. New employees, lined up in the thousands after he announced that. Also, it was a tremendous it was a tremendous public relations coup. It shocked the world. I mean, it was the main headline in every major newspaper. People were stunned. That was a lot of money back then. That was the gold dollar still. It was a $5 gold piece, a quarter ounce of gold. It would be you could live on that today. I guess it probably felt like the equivalent of $200 a day in today's money.
Yeah. And I think beyond worker retainment, it was a real policy of helping the average American in a way that I think imbued a sense of loyalty to him and to his company and to his cause almost. I think that he saw his life, his company, and the cause of Americanism and later America First is all intertwined, heading towards the same goal. Ford fundamentally believed in the basis of American democratic capitalism in a way that I don't think any other industrialist really believed in or tried to embody to any great extent.
Right. He held management accountable for the failures of the business or any profitability issues. He was adamant that if profits weren't high enough, or if a company were running a loss, that they should not turn to bankers and get caught into the debt cycle, the debt trap. And they should not try to take it out of the workers, but that they should find ways to improve the business. So he was adamant that wages should never be cut.
Ford really defines American manufacturing through what's called process engineering, or today you think of it as like systems engineering. This was, again, this is kind of unheard of, even though today we take it for granted. Standardized components, standardized manufacturing processes, and a very easy to manufacture and repair product. So all these things had to be coterminous within the product at the same time. And he was able to expand both economies of scale and economies of scope with fixed expenses, heavy investments into plant and equipment, production lines, so on. And as well as combining specialized functional units with a lot of overhead, reporting, accounting, purchasing, quality assurance, and so on. Now, like I said earlier, he took a lot of these ideas from the Prussian bureaucracy under people like von Moltke. And the merit principle, functional administrative design, and most importantly, decomposition of tasks to almost a monotonous extent with specialized supervisors who were only ever intimately familiar with one or two specific tasks to oversee. Combine that with the stationary assembly line that he took from a meat packing plant, as Adam had mentioned earlier. Put all this together and experimented on making his coils, the magnetrons, or the magnetos, for the car. First time they tried it, didn't really work, but eventually got it down to a science, went from 20 minutes to 13 minutes and 10 seconds to assemble a magnetron. Decided this is a huge cost-saving device. We should start applying this to other things, transmissions, axles, engines, and so on. With the stationary assembly line, after several months of this process engineering work, he goes from 12 hours to about 1.5 hours for assembling a Model T.
Well, this brings up...
I wanted to mention real quick, Adam, if you...
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So this ties in, what Hans saying is very interesting to me because it ties in with what you're saying earlier on the political side with respect to socialism and communism. The Prussian model you may call the other socialism.
Yeah.
As Spengler would put it, William I of Prussia was the first conscious socialist, and that Bismarck himself followed in this tradition. So the fact that he was inspired or influenced by the Prussian way of doing things lends a very heavy credence to the idea that he was in some respects, almost a Prussian socialist. Just at least in terms of type and thinking. And
I don't know if he did it consciously, but I think just intuitively he probably shared the same philosophies.
Well, Hans, was he influenced by the Prussian way of doing things?
Yeah.
So then I don't know if you'd say that's conscious or not in terms that he would call it.
Well, but I don't know what you mean by that, because the manufacturing industry in Germany was very craftsman oriented. It was not mass production on the scale that Ford brought it to was an American phenomenon. That was nowhere else.
I mean, when we're talking about the 19th century, for sure, we're not. Yeah.
And most
of the ideas, though, not necessarily the specific application of the techniques. I'm talking about the philosophical. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's more about administrative design. That he took that and applied it to manufacturing in a way that the Germans had not completely yet accomplished. Although post-Bismarck unification of Germany was able to invest in these manufacturing processes because of so on to keep Anglo goods out. So there was some inheritance there, I think, on the manufacturing side, but it was mostly philosophical and mostly just administrative.
I just wanted to bring up earlier your talk about kind of all the time reductions required for manufacturing and the subsequent, upward possibilities of producing more product with less workers. Mm-hmm. Brings me to the sort of, you could argue, somewhat logical conclusion that the efficiency gains are not always pro-worker. And I can give you some statistics on this. The Highland Park facility, the first big factory they built in Detroit, actually, not Dearborn, was producing Model Ts, and it had approximately 13,000 workers, and their output was probably not very close to what a modern factory can do today, which is around 200,000 vehicles per year. But a modern factory only employs about 5,000 people, and they're also doing arguably much more sophisticated work. And so the sort of workers' paradise, to borrow a phrase from the communist sort of philosophy, is not necessarily achieved with this obsession about efficiency, because you do reach a point, and the sort of reason I don't think they reached it in his lifetime was that the market for automobiles was growing so much that it took up the reduction in per worker requirements per car, so that they didn't actually have to lay anybody off. But as we've seen into later parts of the 20th century, that certainly was the case, where the manufacturing sector in the United States peaked around 1979, and ever since then it's gone down.
Let me ask you an economic question then, Adam, because from a theoretical perspective, increases in efficiency of productivity would increase the marginal revenue product of the worker. Mm-hmm. So do you think that the reason that the going to the individual worker, which would be determined by their individual productivity, their marginal revenue product, did not increase because of Ford's hesitancy to do layoffs?
I mean, of course that helps their ability to keep a job.
But you just see what I'm saying? Like, in theory, if he's improving production and you're saying that that's not accruing to the worker, would it be explained by the fact that he's unwilling to lay them off?
I don't know, honestly. I mean, there's a lot of factors here at play, and I think we can all agree that his sort of willing or desire to keep people employed obviously helped the worker. But I'm just making a broader point about his sort of particular focus, one might say maniacal focus on efficiency, is not necessarily, in the long run at least, very good for the worker, because you do reach a point, and I'll sort of make the argument that I've maybe made in earlier shows, that the sort of theory that you can always get more efficient and you can always automate the job more, and there's always going to be a job waiting for the guy who just lost his job to a robot doing something else in sort of more sophisticated cognitive elite roles. I just don't think that's true, because you take a guy who just moved up from the Mississippi River as a sharecropper and he just got off the train in Detroit, and he's ready to go, and he's working away at putting bolts on a chassis for some Model T, and then suddenly, 30 years later, there's a robot doing that, and you're telling me this guy is going to suddenly learn how to do CNC, machining work with a computer-aided design program, I think is a little bit ridiculous. And the sort of proof that I always give people is that, look, the horse population, which ironically or somewhat apropos, is what Henry Ford explicitly stated as his primary competition, the horse. The horse population in the United States was approximately 20 million at like the turn of the 19th century into the 20th, and today it's around 5 million, and the population has grown quite a bit. Now my numbers may be slightly off, but the trend is certainly the case that the horse population has declined. And obviously, the reason that has happened is because the transportation and pulling power of the horse has been supplanted by superior technology, and that worker, that beast of burden, is no longer employed. And I think a lot of them are essentially employed in recreation rather than work today, so it's not necessarily a need function, and so they have a much more precarious position in society, whereas before they were truly a needed item versus it's a nice to have now. And I think you could say the same thing about a manual labor today, and I think in going into the future that you can probably say the same thing about white collar work, because all this AI stuff is really taking away a lot of the accounting and white collar, even some of the engineering work is being automated away. I just see this sort of, it's a very capitalist impulse to make things more efficient and thereby lowering your cost, and I don't think it necessarily helps the worker in the long run, because they may just be the next horse. They may just not be competitive.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, from the perspective of economics, the workers that would exist there are going to do better off, but you would have...
If they keep their job, yes. But
they keep their
they
job,
may not be
exactly.
paid more. See, the capitalist can retain that savings. There's no reason he has to pay the worker more, because... Yeah. What is the worker's alternative?
Right, well,
I mean, he's not competitive, so he's worth
theory,
sort of being...
Because theory would dictate that they would naturally be paid more, but as we know about the realities of capitalism...
Look at what's happened to the United States. The wealth inequality has increased.
I don't disagree at
That's
all.
right.
I'm just saying that my initial question was just out of curiosity as to whether... Because, you're describing Ford as making these... leaps forward in terms of efficiency and production, and you're saying that this wasn't really accruing to the worker, and at the same time
it did. I think partly because he was somewhat paternalistic in his ethos.
Gotcha. Yeah,
but his competitors hated him after he did that.
Right.
I mean, they had to match their wage rates now, because everybody wanted to work for Ford, so they hated his guts.
You get the best out of capitalism when your scions of capitalism and industry are like pseudo socialists.
Yeah, well, when they give a fuck about their common man. I mean, that's a rare thing, though.
Right, a socialist in the best sense.
Right.
Yeah. You guys want to do World War I?
Ford just never had to grapple with robotics. He started this process in motion, but a human hand was still required for every motion in...
Well, you may think of a robot as something out of a sort of Hollywood movie with like blinking lights, but I mean, they had a lot of mechanization, a lot of the if you look at, there may be footage, but you can at least look at still pictures of their earlier factories, like the Highland Park facility. There were a lot of belt-driven systems and machinery that were powered by machines, and it wasn't a human doing that labor.
It's just a case of capital equipment as it becomes more sophisticated, placating the need for labor.
Right.
World War One.
Do we want to talk about process engineering, Hans, or are you ready to go to the next one?
That was pretty much it for the process engineering. I mean, this is also when electricity was becoming more widely available, and U.S. was using its global clout to expand for raw materials around the world that allowed these manufacturing processes to grow and thrive in a way that I don't think would have been possible without these other elements going on. But World War One is where Henry Ford, the man, makes his name more so than just Henry Ford, the engineer, or Henry Ford, the inventor.
I think he even tried to run for Congress at one point, but he threw in the towel after seeing what a snake of vipers, politics is, and he went back to his factory. But yeah, tell us about the peace ship and all that.
I'll be brief with it. There's a great article, and I'll include it in the references, from American Heritage magazine on Henry Ford and his peace ship. It's a very long article, but I do recommend it. Basically, Henry Ford felt that America shouldn't be becoming involved in this, what he thought of as this silly war in Europe. He didn't understand really why the European powers were so willing to kill each other in great numbers over what seemed like petty differences. Being on the age of the mechanical era and the industrialized era, I think that World War One shocked a lot of people with the sheer casualties and the inventions being deployed in the field. These machines of war that were totally shocking to the people of the early 20th century.
But Ford did understand one very key fact about the war, which was, to quote Ford, German Jewish bankers caused the war.
Yeah. So Ford believed in a couple of things. One, I think being so close to mechanized industry all of his life, seeing it employed as a means for Europeans to kill one another in these huge numbers, where you have 30,000-40,000 people dying in an hour or two in these battles, on the especially in the French and German front. And beyond that, he obviously saw there was some machinations of other industrialists and Jewish bankers and Jewish financiers behind the war. And I think fundamentally he was a populist who wanted American lives to be saved from having to fight this war that a lot of Americans fundamentally saw as a European problem. The American view of Europe at the time was, even amongst recent European immigrants, was that's none of our concern as much as far as politics goes. The politics of Europe stay in Europe, and the politics of the Americas stay in America. And for someone like him, who had been raised as a yeoman farmer in the Midwest, it was totally baffling, like why American lives and American boys are going to be spent and get shot in the face because Germans and French and English can't come to a basic agreement about how they're going to behave. So he, in November 1915, he starts these peace rallies, peace activities in America with people like Thomas Edison, but a lot of other groups. With one, Rosika Schwimmer and Louis Lochner, and the International Federation of Students and other organizations. And they start going around Detroit. They start going around the country. He gets people like David Starr Jordan, who was the president of Stanford University and chairman of the Fifth International Peace Congress, to help him out with trying to convince Wilson to stay out of the war.
That, as I mentioned earlier, Hans, he was one of Ford's chief influences.
Mm.
If I can cut in for a sec, one other motivation of his in opposing the war was that he saw the distortion that it caused in the economy. The Federal Reserve had just been created at the end of 1913, and credit was being extended to war profiteers. And he saw this kind of industry as not benefiting the U.S., as being focused on, well, rewarding investors with quick short-term profits and without any real benefits accruing to the U.S., to the regular people.
And I have a quote from Kevin McDonald on David Starr Jordan, and describing Jordan's ideas. This is Jordan speaking. This is McDonald citing Jordan from 1912. Jordan described an unseen empire of international finance, largely composed of Jewish banking firms originating with the Rothschilds. Behind these firms were Jewish families allied to one another by so many close ties of blood, marriage, and business, including Bischofheim, France, Bleichschroeder, Germany, Commando, Italy, Goldschmidt and Stern, England and Portugal, Gunzburg, Russia, Herschen, Wertheimer, Austria, Cassel, Europe and Egypt, Sassoon, Rothschilds of the Orient, and Mendelssohn and Montefiore in Australia. And also McDonald, according to Jordan, because of massive national debts, the financiers effectively controlled the countries they operated in, either by threatening to withhold loans or by making conditions on loans. Ultimately, Jordan blamed the borrowers for their profligacy and short-sightedness. As a pacifist, Jordan was deeply concerned that the military spending of his day would bring about an Armageddon. In general, he saw the financiers as eager to loan money for weaponry but opposed to actual war. His clear message, however, is that this unseen empire of finance had a very large influence on the ability of governments to wage war. He presented several examples where the wars ended because financiers refused to loan any more money for the war effort. Given this intellectual environment and given the gruesome reality of what was simply called the Great War, Ford presumably inferred that Jewish financiers must at least have allowed it to happen. And indeed, this is the argument made in The International Jew.
Right.
Real quick, one of the war profiteers, as Alex put it, in Ford's mind was the DuPont Corporation in the United States, which was a major arms manufacturer, and they were selling, I think, munitions to Europe on, I don't know if it was both sides, but the United States actually was making a lot of money from Europeans buying a lot of the manufactured goods.
Oh, yeah. And the U.S. was also a creditor nation. I mean, in a lot of ways, American surplus credit kept this war going. And the constant question, will the Americans intervene? And there was often doubt that it was, this aspersion of doubt that was cast. This also encouraged the Europeans to continue fighting. It was like, well, at many points it seemed like the Americans weren't going to get involved. So why would we stop fighting? And by the time the Americans had gotten involved, Germany in particular was so committed to the war and had realized that abdication of any kind would mean total destruction. So it was just a policy of losing slowly, really, at that stage. So Ford, he catches the flu, and other people get pneumonia while they're on this ship in December, traveling across the Atlantic. And
the peace ship.
Yeah, Oscar II. And they arrive in its first destination, Oslo. And
why there? I mean, not exactly a belligerent country, but
well, so Norway wasn't too involved with the war yet, even though the Norwegian government was along with the Danes were preparing for war, and he attempted to broker peace, and people weren't really interested, and sick that he couldn't really even make public appearances. He spoke to the press briefly, and then people convinced him to leave just a few days after getting there, and they left back to the United States. Although Ford,
I see this as a failure of activism, as the NRX guys might say. Ford was the only elite, it seemed, in this effort. He bankrolled it with $500,000, and he failed to get. He signed up at the bequest. It wasn't his initiative; it was the initiative of people like Rosika Schwimmer, who's a Jew, a Hungarian Jew,
Mm.
a suffragette, anti-communist. And Jane Addams was another suffragette, American suffragette. Lochner, a Lutheran. These guys went around trying to drum up support. They lobbied Wilson. Wilson turned them down. They talked to Edison, some other big industrialists. But there was, the press took the angle of mocking them. They referred to it as the ship of fools. So Ford, while he was an elite industrialist, he wasn't really a part of the American elite. And so they just didn't have the backing for this activism to succeed.
Well, Ford actively hated the elite. I mean, maybe that's too strong of a word, but he despised their sort of airs, the way they brought their attitude to everything when they wouldn't actually do any work themselves. He just despised that sort of philosophy of having others do things for you. He wanted people to be at work.
Yeah, he didn't see himself as part of the WASP cultural elite of America, I don't think. And I don't think that he really saw himself as needing to be a part of that, or that it was his duty to join that class. And he was alone in this quest amongst the elites of America to prevent it was American intervention into war, which I think he was worried about.
Well, it's deeply ironic, though, because, I mean, he's behaving as an elite should. He's looking out for the far-sighted interests of the people.
Right.
And behaving as a fucking adult, as opposed to a bunch of petulant little, like, Princeton weenies, like Wilson.
Yeah. I mean, American public approval for entering the war, I can't remember the polls. I should have looked them up beforehand, but they had some rudimentary polls done, and it was monumentally against intervening in Europe. Europe, of all places, was the last place Americans wanted to fight, particularly because at the time, much of the white population of America was still descendant from the founding stock, who just had a sort of contemptuous regard for Europeans, especially after all the trials and tribulations of Napoleon and all the various wars that had gone on in Europe over the 18th century. Americans just view this war as yet another European conflict that they were glad to be out of.
Yeah, the Atlanticist elite were intensely Anglophilic and wanted more than anything to see England triumphant.
Right. And there's good evidence that had America not intervened and supplied first weapons and supplies and credit and so on to the Allies in World War I, that the Germans would have been successful in at least defeating France and potentially defeating England, because they defeated the Russians on their own. They defeated them on the battlefield, and then they tricked them with sending Lenin back, I suppose, and others back to Russia to take down the Tsar.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets a little ironic, though, because the same forces, the same Jewish banking forces that were equally allied with the Anglophilic Atlanticist section of the elite were also bankrolling the Russian Revolution, people like Jacob Schiff, who would turn out to be a minor thorn. The thorn would increase, but he became a problem for Henry Ford, but he then died in 1920.
Right. But I think that there's good evidence that the axis of that war, the Germans, the Austrians, and the Turks could have easily defeated the French and the British.
I agree.
Time been allowed.
I think that as far as various counterfactuals of the 20th century, I think American involvement in the First World War is a fairly easy one to establish as a sine qua non of the eventual outcome. Yeah.
And as we would see later, Ford was also not unbiased. He had a certain affection for the Germans. And,
no question.
And I don't know what totally influenced it. I think it was just he wasn't really of German stock. His mom was Belgian, but I think that he appreciated their culture. The Germany of the late 19th century and the early 20th century was, I think, a fascinating place for a lot of non-Germans. Just this, particularly, United Germany, with this sort of craftsmanship ethic and this huge diversity in language and in microcultures and
It was the best of
appearance.
Europe.
Yeah,
It always was.
Very strong middle class, high standard of living.
Yeah.
To not admire it is, you got to ask yourself, like, are you even white, bro?
Well, to say it was
And I think
always that way is, I don't think, accurate. But I think after the unification of Germany under Bismarck,
Yes.
it became the primary rival to England, and that's why England tried to destroy it.
Well, I'm not talking about like raw, economic.
No,
development.
I know you're not,
Of
but
course.
I'm not talking about just that either. But I think that's probably the most recognizable, measurable one that comes to people's mind when they think of Germany. But it's also like, how far back do you want to go? But it's not the leading country until the 19th century. It really wasn't even a country at all.
Yeah.
And it was a bunch of little city states or states under their own. So it really depends where you start the measure. But by the 19th century, I would agree with you.
Right.
Well, it is also the physical heartland of Europe.
Yeah. And so he's not unbiased. So there were a lot of dimensions, I think, to the Fordist approach to World War I and the peace effort, but it really broke down into fond of Germans, a particular keen interest through some of his mentors' teachings in potential Jewish machinations behind the war, and a real fear that Americans were going to lose their lives and die horribly in this really traumatic war, these huge machines, over something that he thought wasn't their concern.
And it's interesting too, if the listener wants to look at that industrial side of warfare. Ernst Junger's memoir From the War, Storm of Steel, is a good place to go.
Yeah.
But I would say, with respect to the Jewish machinations and the trauma and the criminality and the horror of American involvement and everything that came with it, there's no doubt that this was the major influence on what would come shortly thereafter as the publications of the International Jew, the world's foremost problem.
Yeah.
Which would you guys like to get into that now?
Well, I want to bring up something before we get into that. Two things, really. But Henry Ford was not totally opposed to helping the United States once it was clear the U.S. was going to enter the war. He took on a number of defense contracts and worked on presidential advisory committees and government advisory committees like the Shipping Board, and he worked closely with the Secretary of the Navy and Wilson to apply his manufacturing processes, his logistics prowess, and so on. And also, curiously, despite having chartered the peace ship, it then took on a huge contract for the Eagle class boat, which were sort of, I think, small frigate class light attack vessel and transport vessel. And he was chided a lot for this, and he was chided for not putting his son Edsel into the war. And obviously, Henry didn't believe in this war, thought it was ridiculous and Americans were fighting it. But in his mind, if the Americans were going to go to war, he was going to be involved, and he was going to do what he had to do to help the United States.
Yeah, and it's sad too that effort of centralization was spearheaded by the notorious Jew speculator Bernard Baruch, who was put in charge of the war. What was it called? It's the War Board, the War Industries
War Production Board.
It was the War Industries Board, and he was responsible for centralizing American industry on behalf of the perfidious war effort.
Well, I was just going to ask, how much of the Ford's involvement was voluntary? I believe a lot of the companies, like in World War II, were somewhat coerced into helping the war effort. I don't know if that's
Oh,
actually
well,
true.
in World War II, yeah. I mean, you had.
I know,
exactly
and
what
in the
happened
Second
in
World
War
War,
II,
yes, that I mean it essentially
it was a
became
little less heavy-handed in the First World War, but I think that
Right.
you can look at it that way. That from a certain perspective, Ford did not have a lot of choice in the issue.
Yeah,
I
it
don't
was
think
highly
he tried to make a
suggested.
profit. He wrote about how he helped England with tractors. He made Ford built a tractor, and England had not enough grain. We were shipping them grain, but he thought it would be easier. Well, England thought it would be easier if they could grow more there, and so he had the first cheap, reliable tractor.
And this was
he,
not
he
the only.
shipped-
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Alex.
So he shipped over tractors and parts to make tractors in England, and it was a big help. But he didn't. I don't think he made a profit from it. Sure, it kept his factory running, and employed people. But he wasn't. He didn't revel in profits.
No, and this wasn't the first, or this was the first, but it was not the last time that Ford would be involved in some of the blemishes of the 20th century. I mean, in 1929, the Ford Motor Company did make an agreement with the Soviet Union to open the, forgive me my pronunciation if we have any Russians, the Govorsky Automobilin Zavod, GAV, GAZ. They produced a Ford Model A, interestingly enough, as well as a Ford Model AA. But we'll save it for another episode and get into the machinations sort of behind the scenes in the industrialists with respect to the world conflicts in the early half of the 20th century. The writer Anthony Sutton has gone into this. There's some conspiracy type tier stuff. That's a.
Can I comment on that briefly?
Yeah.
I do encourage anybody to listen to Anthony Sutton. He's very entertaining, if nothing else. I, however, I'm not convinced that Ford was part of any world conspiracy.
I agree with you, Adam.
I just don't see it in his character. But he also, I think, his explanation for reason going to Russia was that he was a true believer in this philosophy of giving Fordism to each country in a very nationalistic way. And he also thought that would even be a bulwark against communism, which I think is a very naive view. But he thought that if only Russia could see the opportunities created by these wonderful, car factories and giving their workers, an opportunity to make some money and buy the cars and whatnot, he thought that would actually convince the Russians to abandon communism and adopt his philosophy. And he was trying that in many countries. But that's, I think, genuinely what he wanted to do. Yeah.
Naive is definitely the correct word, because the irony of that is the same Jewish bankers who bankrolled it, like Jacob Schiff, saw exactly that as the future for Russia. They saw communism as a temporary phase by which they could seize control of the capital in the country, and then they could enter into a capitalist phase. Stalin thwarted that, and which is why I've mentioned before he is sort of a pseudo anti-hero of the tragic 20th century. But I will also add that Ford was by no means naive or unaware of the horrors of Jewish Bolshevism. He had, for instance, there was he was involved with there was a military physician, Hutton Harris, who was closely involved with a Russian refugee named Boris Brasol, and the two of them were involved in producing an English version of the Protocols. And Brasol himself got in touch with the editors of the Dearborn Independent, which then published an article by Brasol discussing the horrors of the Bolsheviks.
Interesting.
Why
Alex,
don't you talk about
quickly...
the international Jew?
Yeah, well, that's a good segue into the international Jew, because the specter of the Protocols is it's going to come up. So I have a couple different materials on this. I'm going to be relying a lot on Professor McDonald, and McDonald had an interesting review of Edwin Black's work. And Edwin Black is a Jewish historian / journalist who wrote a interesting book. I mean, it's full of falsehoods and spin, but it is an interesting book that traces the origins of the eugenics movement from America to England to Germany. The book's called War Against the Weak. We will probably discuss it when we get around to doing our episode on eugenics. But in this case, the book in question was Nazi Nexus, America's Corporate Connections to Hitler's Holocaust. And Black says in this book, to purvey this new brand of Jew hatred, political anti-Semitism, to the world, Ford purchased a failed newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which serialized the protocols for 91 weeks. His company then published the series as a book, The International Jew. Using the techniques of mass production, Ford was able to escalate the protocols from a negligible, randomly circulated irritant to a national sensation of 500,000 copies, devoting the national sales force to the assets of the Ford Motor Company to the task made Henry Ford the first to organize political anti-Semitism in America. Indeed, he was the hero of anti-Semites the world over. Now, this statement is just so fucking wrong that it's cartoonish. Like, and this guy is supposed to be some kind of, respected Jew intellectual. Really, he's just a liar and a pig. But to the point, the key point is this association with the protocols is just very intellectually lazy and dubious. Ford was indeed probably aware of the protocols, but the protocols have absolutely nothing to do with the international Jew. I mean, to say it's a serialization of the protocols is completely insane. And we can find all kinds of, you could go look on, I have an article from Jeffrey Goldberg's The Atlantic. Which this one isn't really dealing with, this was dealing with a little bit later history, so maybe I'll save it if it comes up. But you'll find this kind of thing. I mean, just look in all of your favorite publications, your favorite Jewish journals, your favorite Jewish newspapers, and you'll find this kind of stuff of Ford is promoting this irrational anti-Semitism. It's a bunch of low tier propaganda that's just there to encourage Jew hatred or something. No, the International Jew was a very serious examination of the Jewish question. It had some things wrong. It had also, from the perspective of maybe you would say a diehard anti-Semite, it's even a little bit too fair to the Jew. In other ways, though, here's I could read the chapter headings and stuff. It turned out to be very long. What it was yes, Ford bought the Dearborn Independent. I can't speak to whether or not it was a quote failed newspaper. I don't know, Adam. Is that true? Is it really a failed newspaper?
I don't know. But
okay. Well, what it was, first of all, it was not written by Ford. It was written by two of Ford's guys, Ernst Leibold and Billy Cameron. And Leibold was a college educated bank president, and Cameron was a journalist, and he was a sort of a proto-Christian identitarian. And it was a series of columns, and eventually this series of columns was put into a 4-volume book form that constituted The International Jew, the world's foremost problem. And he made some. Professor McDonald gives a very good summary, and I'll just read some of the points that remain relevant to this day. Jews had achieved a great deal of economic success in the U.S., even to the point of dominating certain industries. International Jew emphasized Jewish domination in the movie industry because it viewed the movie industry as undermining the sexual mores of America. We just talked about this. Not only that, McDonald references Neil Gabler's work, which we also discussed. The International Jew is careful to note that its concerns with the moral messages in movies are not idiosyncratic, but part of a larger cultural conflict between the movie industry and large segments of the American public. Quote, in almost every state, there are movie censorship bills pending with the old wet and gambling elements against them, the awakened part of the decent population in favor of them, always the Jewish producing firms constituting the silent pressure behind the opposition. Jewish organizations had launched highly successful campaigns to remove references to Christianity from the U.S. public culture and to legitimize Judaism as a religion on par with Protestantism and Catholicism. This was a key point to Henry Ford himself. Jewish organizations had been able to impose their ethnic interests on certain key areas of domestic policy. They were the main force behind unrestricted immigration. By 1920, unrestricted immigration policy had continued nearly 20 years after U.S. public opinion had turned against it. Jews had been able to impose their ethnic interests in the area of foreign policy despite widespread feelings that the policies advocated by the Jewish community were often not in the best interests of the United States. The main examples that the International Jew talks about were the abrogation of the Russian trade agreement in 1911 and post-World War I policy towards Eastern Europe. In these cases, American Jewish attitudes were more in line with what they saw as the interest of foreign Jews rather than the economic and political interests of the U.S. The International Jew argued that Jews had been the major force behind the success of Bolshevism. I mean, Jews were the main component and by far the most energetic component of the radical left in the United States, a movement that advocated a massive political, economic, and cultural transformation. Jews as suffering from moral particularism, is it good for the Jews? And
so,
it's ruthlessly...
if I could just cut in real quick, hearing all this stuff seems about right to me from what I can gather from my own experience in life. But go ahead and finish, and I'll make my final comment.
I got two more because this is a very good overview. I mean, when you get the unabridged copy of International Jew, which I encourage you to do, you can find it online. It's worth reading. It goes in a lot of detail. You'll find. I mean, it's very long. I mean, depending on the text and typesetting, etc., it can be from 800 to 900 pages. And this is a very good outline of the most prescient and enduringly relevant points. So just two more. Jews had attained a substantial influence over the U.S. media via a virtual monopoly on the movie production business, domination of theater and music business, influence in journalism, newspapers. Jews were able to apply economic pressure on newspapers owned by non-Jews because of the importance of advertising by Jewish-owned department stores in major cities. And then, although tending to exaggerate, the big Professor McDonald's main critique of the work is that it over-exaggerates the Jewish unity. Interestingly enough, as Alex pointed out, you did have some Jews who were anti-Bolshevik and anti-war. This is all true. The point I would editorialize, I think I would assume Professor McDonald would agree with this, is that Jewish unity was far weaker pre-Zionism to post-Zionism. Zionism has really changed the field on that. But just as a few more notes that were relevant to Ford himself too, was that it was a great. There was these campaigns to remove public displays of Christianity, and interestingly enough, it was also in the International Jew discussed the Jewish efforts that were in fact successful to remove Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice from the high school curriculum, and of course the open immigration, U.S. foreign policy towards so-called anti-Jewish countries such as Romania and Poland after World War I. And so, there's
and how they rigged the 1919 World Series.
Oh, right. Well, that was a Jewish mafioso, if I remember correctly.
So let's say that a lot of what he talked about and a lot of what he pinned on Jews, Jews now admit to, and other people of great stature have also admitted to Jews being behind this. So it was only a year or two that Vladimir Putin, a man who is arguably philo-Semitic towards the Russian Jewish community and to Israel, admitted in an open speech talking to Jews that they were behind Bolshevism.
Daily reminder that Russia has Holocaust truth laws.
Right. Things like the ACLU, often joked as the ACLU, has been probably the leading anti-public displays of Christianity force in American history, particularly in probably the 20th century. Jews often admit to being behind modern architecture, to being behind porn liberalization, to being behind anti-smoking campaigns, which I think Henry Ford might agree with, but it was done for very different reasons. They often admit to these things like the Jewish century and so on, that they've done all this and that they've done it for the greater good. They'll often say that they're the leading force behind gay marriage liberalization, that they're the leading force behind immigration liberalization. So Henry Ford was right in a lot of ways. Now, America of the early 20th century was a place not kind to Jews to begin with, so he found a lot of support. He received a lot of what I would call institutional pushback. So he received pushback from church bodies, from religious bodies, from civil rights groups or human rights groups, from the government, from other industrialists, from progressive academics in the Northeast, and so on. They were the ones who created this culture of Henry Ford's a crazy person. Henry Ford is a paranoid old man who doesn't understand how the world works.
And at the center of this was the American Jewish Committee.
Yes.
And the key figures from that were Jacob Schiff, Louis Marshall, and Cyrus Adler.
Right.
And Schiff, he basically, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, he died in 1920. And he was a little, as much as, Jews got a Jew, he was a shrewd man, and he understood that, to quote Schiff, if we get into a controversy, we shall light a fire, which no one can foretell how it will become extinguished. And I would strongly advise, therefore, that no notice be taken of the articles, and the attack will soon be forgotten.
Yeah.
So while he was waging a campaign, he also was arguing for a certain level of crypto, But because he died, his far less prudent successor, Louis Marshall, underwent a full-blown campaign. And they managed to get themselves a Shabbos named John Spargo, who wrote a book attacking Ford specifically called The Jew and American Ideals, which you can imagine what that's about. And this also culminated in what Spargo ended up writing this statement called The Perils of Racial Prejudice. And he solicited signatures from, quote, over 100 prominent citizens of Gentile extraction and Christian faith, which included Taft, Wilson, and Harding, and many others. And there appeared in a major newspaper in 1921, quote, President Wilson heads protest against anti-Semitism. This certainly should have some echoes for today for the listener with respect to Trump.
I'd like to pose some questions to you guys after hearing all this, and let me get through the outline of the questions before you answer. But first one that comes to mind is, what do you think motivated Henry Ford to say or support the publication of these things, and what do you think constitutes an anti-Semite? And I'll add an interesting factoid that I think bears some relevance, and you can interpret it many ways, but I'll give mine after you guys give yours. Real quick, Nick. He employed a Jewish architect by the name of Albert Kahn, who designed his two most important factories, at least in the company's early history. And he designed the Highland Park factory in Detroit, and to this day, still the largest Ford facility in the world, the River Rouge factory. So with that, I'll let you guys comment.
Okay, so I was not the saga. We can go further into the saga and what happened, but let me answer your question first. The best definition of an anti-Semite comes from Joe Sobran. An anti-Semite is someone whom Jews dislike. Ford was not a racialist, so his problem with Jews was not a racial issue per se. It was an issue of unassimilated Jews. So Jews that he would be, and I think Walt Disney had a similar ethos, and he had a similar relationship with the Jews. And both of their firms still exist in control of Jews, sadly enough. But he was not a racialist, and as such, his objection to Jews was not a it was based on a cultural conflict, a cultural problem. He viewed Jewish interests as opposed to American Gentile interests insofar as Jews acted qua Jews, insofar as they engaged in ethnic nepotism, networking, and did not assimilate at all. So if I don't know the specific case of Henry Ford's architect, but assuming that he was an assimilated Jew, Ford would have no problem with that. Ford's issue was with Jews acting as a international body, a state within a state. I mean, these are familiar criticisms, and these are rational criticisms. So the key thing to understand is Ford was not a political radical. I mean, he was a scion of industry. He was very much a man of his time, and his views were also not abnormal for a man of his time. What's abnormal is that a man would come from that class and be willing to challenge a very powerful group. That's what made him, and I think that's explained partly by what we've been discussing, which is his certain, you may say, socialistic qualities. His view of him, he takes a certain responsibility. He behaves like a true elite and takes responsibility for the people. And so I think he was motivated out of a very honest sense of altruism. I mean, there's nothing incendiary in this book. I guess if you're given reading it, you're probably more likely to get angry reading it now, I think. Maybe you would over the course of the Second World War or First World War. And I don't doubt that I can't speak to whether people involved in America First had all read it, if Charles Lindbergh had read it, but I imagine that he had. And it definitely informed sort of the educated anti-Semitic stratum to a certain extent. Because, I mean, and keep in mind, these columns were written at a level that your average high schooler would struggle with, because we live in a society of retards who have been systematically dumbed down through the industrial education machine. And these are very serious articles that go into depth, and they're very nuanced. They're not, and this brings me back to my point. It was partly from McDonald's criticism of Black, that this accusation that these are the protocols it's just completely absurd. This was not anti-Semitic propaganda. This was a genuine asking of the Jewish question. That's what it was. It wasn't there to just throw gasoline on something.
I'd say that Ford's opinions were probably not unique. I mean, he probably was typical of men of his time, although, maybe he had a little more impetus due to his fights with bankers. But and his opinion about his opinion on finance was, very, very conservative, very anti-banker. But also, he had the power. He had full control over his company at this point. He owned 100% of the shares, and it was a very profitable company. He was not dependent on the banking system. He was his own man, and that's rare. It was rare then.
It was 100.
Rare now.
It was a completely private company, and I'm glad you brought this up in relation to his work on the International Jew, because I had forgotten to mention it. But he didn't have any public shares of the company available on any stock markets. It wasn't until his grandson took over the company in the late 40s and early 50s that Ford was put back on the New York Stock Exchange. So he effectively out-Jewed the Jews, or out-Jewed other Anglos, with this scheme in 1918 to take his son and his son's connections to some Boston banking groups to buy out people like the Dodge brothers, who had been approaching Ford and saying, you need to give out higher dividends relative to the profits of the company. The company was making about $250 million at the time annually, and he had about 40,000 employees. And these investors approached him and said, "Look, we want higher dividends, we want better return on investment, we want changes of the business, so on." And then they used the government against him. They sued him in court. So he hatched this plan to rid himself of these people, and a great deal of his, I think, impetus for looking more closely at who was behind these financial networks, often found Jews, was due to these early experiences with what were effectively just other Anglos and these business machinations that almost stripped his company from him. And he ended up paying about $108 million, which was a huge sum of money, to buy out these people and retain full control of his business for about the next 30 years of his life.
I just want to comment how extraordinary it is, especially in a industrial era, to maintain independence from bankers when you have to have huge amounts of money to even get started in manufacturing. So it truly was
extraordinary.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, really extraordinary. I mean, so the saga, it culminates. He was in 1922. He did put a stop to the articles. The reason for it is not entirely clear. I mean, we can speculate what went on behind the scenes, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it certainly wasn't because he had a change of mind, because no one who ever apprehends the truth ever has a change of mind. They have a change of pocketbook. And so what happened, like, there were still counter-Jewish references that appeared in the Dearborn. And the chairman of Sears and Roebuck, Julius Rosenwald, was criticized in the Dearborn Independent. This is after the International Jews stopped running. He was criticized for encouraging Negro migration from the South into Chicago by providing expensive land and housing. And this is the linkage between Jewish money and the Negro problem, which, quote, this is from his paper, resulted in the corrupting the neighborhood, driving away older owners, and leading to the race riots of 1919. Gee, where have I heard this before?
Yeah, a large contingency of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, were of Jewish extraction with no discernible African blood.
Oh yeah, and it's sadly we will get into what became of his legacy at the end, but unfortunately the Ford Foundation has become since then a major beneficiary of the National Negro Association, or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
And
just to comment on the Great Migration, as it's called, from the heavily, predominantly black parts of America in the South to the Midwest. A lot of that had to do with economics. It was during after the $5 a day wage was announced, a lot of black people saw that as an opportunity. And also during the Depression and World War II, there was a tremendous need for people to find work, and then also later to have labor. So there was a huge amount of people moving up because of that. And these are forces that are just so macro. I don't think you can pin it on the NAACP.
Well, no, you don't pin it on the NAACP, but you pin it on the industrialists who didn't have a problem with the idea of the blackening of white neighborhoods. And no coincidence there, they're frequently Jewish. So the point is not so much that it was like a deliberate conspiracy to negrify an area. It was that these people didn't give a shit if it became negrified.
I think that's more accurate. I think people were looking to make money. And
and they don't care because it doesn't matter to them.
Well, we see that today with immigration. People who live in these glass bubble cities who advocate for immigration, while people in the Central Valley of California are losing their job and finding themselves cooking meth in their microwave ovens.
Right. So Ford was sued by this annoying Jew, Aaron Shapiro, who was a Jew activist who dealt with farming issues, which, it's very euphemistic. I doubt the guy ever farmed in his life. But he was became subject to a libel suit. And also beforehand, there was articles that this Jew had produced, the Jew was responding to the articles in the Dearborn Independent, such as the Jewish exploitation of farmers, organizations, monopoly traps operate under the guise of marketing associations. This was the subject of the lawsuit. And there was a mistrial declared in 1927 because of allegations that a juror had been bribed by a Jew. And
Der
so
ewige Jude.
yeah, exactly. And so Ford, this is when Ford finally folded up the Dearborn, and he settled the lawsuit with the Jewish irritant. And it wasn't exactly clear some of what was going on behind the scenes, but Ford did sign, or someone signed this like Bolshevik style like apology letter. There's no indication Ford ever even read it. Either he signed it or one of his right-hand men signed it.
There were people complaining to Ford that his quote-unquote anti-Semitism was hurting Ford's business. And to
that point, he himself said that he did it because of an attempt by New York Jews to take over the Ford Motor Company. And so he did sign this this Bolshevik style apology that was drafted by Louis Marshall, the sort of head honcho at the American Jewish Committee after the death of Jacob Schiff. And the apology, what the actual letter says is that he was, quote, fully aware of the virtues of the Jewish people as a whole, of what they did and their ancestors have done for civilization and to mankind, and towards the development of commerce and industry, of their sobriety and diligence, their benevolence, and their unselfish interest in the public welfare.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh my God, man. I mean, and then his one of his right-hand men, Marshall wrote that Ford had told him that Cameron, the proto-Christian identitarian, was out of a job, and had indicated his willingness to write on the Jewish side of the subject, which Marshall said, I replied, we did not need his help. That's kind of the end of the saga of Ford and the Jews. I mean, there's kind of two little anecdotal things to mention too as well, which is in 1938 he received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle.
Yes.
And he accepted it honorably and happily, despite the oying and the veying and the kvetching. By the way, Charles Lindbergh also received it. And he also provided financial support for notorious counter-Semite Gerald L.K. Smith, who himself continued publishing The International Jew into the post-World War II period. And Ernst Leibold, one of the him and Cameron were the two authors. He fed information to Charles Coughlin while Coughlin was doing his 1930s radio broadcasts. And of course, when Ford died, the Ford company just went into total globalist mode. With they actually began supporting Jewish charities in the state of Israel. And in 1997, the Ford Motor Company sponsored a commercial-free telecast of Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List.
Fitting.
Yeah,
of course. They'll never live this down. I mean, they did the same thing to IBM because they sold a couple of punch card machines to.
Yeah, it's funny you actually mention
Germany.
IBM. It's kind of a tangent, but that's IBM is one of the major subject of.
I mean, this tactic, I'll just come out and say it. It's a shakedown tactic. You get accused of anti-Semitism. That is essentially the mark they use against you to extract shekels. It's
shekels, but it's also they legitimately want to shut you down.
Well, I mean, if that's preferable, sure. But I mean, if they can get money, and that's preferable, I think they'll do that. It just depends on who you are. All right, so you covered a pretty big span just now, and I wanted to bring us right before World War II, where I'd like to bring a discussion to after we kind of get through the interwar period and the Great Depression, because I think those are important issues. I want to bring up the River Rouge factory. So this was, as I mentioned, it was designed by this architect of Henry Ford's Albert Kahn, and at the time, and for a very long time afterwards, the River Rouge, which is built on the river, Detroit River, I believe, in Dearborn, is the is one of the largest facilities in the world, just full stop. And it was incorporating many principles of Ford's worldview into this one site. And not only the size and the scope, but also just the nature of how it interacted with the economy and the natural resources that were a part of creating the cars that Ford sells. And so after World War I, the controls that the government placed on industrial firms like Ford's caused Henry Ford to want to remove any outsider influence on his company as much as possible. And so the River Rouge factory which is now a separate division. Actually, it's a separate company from Ford. It was sold off. But at the time when the Rouge was built, it actually had its own blast furnace and iron ore processing facility that would then feed into the assembly plant for the cars. And in conjunction with places like Fordlandia, which I previously mentioned, which was producing things like rubber, Ford also owned all through the company iron ore deposits, timber. I don't even know if you got into fabric, manufacturing, but essentially everything that went into the interior, exterior, engine, everything that made a car, Ford wanted to own. And it was a vertical integration strategy that was partly inspired by this government interference in his company during World War I, and also just his ambition to scale up the idealism of having a car for everyone in the world. And the River Rouge facility was comically compared to this. So this was from humorist Mick Luke. So two flies can manufacture 48,876,532,154 new flies in 6 months. But they haven't anything on two Ford factories. So nothing like this was anywhere else in the world. I mean, people were making pilgrimages to this facility, which had the blast furnace and the assembly plants and multiple buildings and control towers and highways and roads, and probably had its own police department. I mean, it was a city unto itself, and there was nothing like this. And it was pumping out these Model Ts, and they rose. They were able to produce at one point 1.8 million Model T cars, which is just extraordinary. I mean, even modern factories don't produce that much. So with this facility, and during the Roaring '20s, Ford was doing really well, and the country as a whole, the United States, was doing very well. And unionism, which became an issue during the Depression and during World War II and after World War II, was not really a thing. But I'd like to pause there and see if you guys have any comments about kind of the interwar years.
So I have some stuff on his business expansion and on River Rouge. So over the course of the 20s, with the Roaring '20s, Ford expanded into aviation. He expanded, civilian aviation, actually, and then he expanded into defense contracting. He expanded into universities, hotels, and also tractors. And this was a deliberate attempt by him, I think, to determine what it was that could improve, as we mentioned earlier, the average lives of Americans. He also set up a lot of trusts and small, like, proto organizations that brought back things like gardening, traditional dancing, bird watching, and so on, and trade schools in the Michigan area and in other parts of the country. Now, on the subject of River Rouge, the model that I think he was going for was more in line with colonial power model. So the British Empire would own iron ore deposits outright in, let's say, somewhere in South America. And they would also own...
the iron ore was predominantly in the Great Lakes regions, I believe.
Oh, okay. But in this, let's say in this model, they own it. It's somewhere else, or it's nearby, or whatever. They also work closely, or they own the shipping company and this East India Company, and they have a tight relationship with the manufacturers back in England, who would then utilize these raw resources. So his model was essentially a self-enclosed, a colonial power model that was international in nature. And I think had he not done this in his mind, if he had worked with third-party contractors, which is very common in shipping, logistics, and even just basic manufacturing today, like we see with Apple and Tesla and so on, this would allow for takeover possibilities by what he deemed were hostile elements. And you're right, River Rouge was kind of like this insane experiment. It's kind of like that Soviet factory, Magnitogorsk. Magnitogorsk. That was like the largest factory in the Soviet Union. Was like a city unto itself, and had its own fire departments, own security systems.
Hitler's grave. They pumped out so much steel for those T-34s or whatever was rolling across the Russian steppe to crush the Wehrmacht, etc.
Yeah. So this place had 15 miles of internal roadway or railway, 120 miles of conveyor belt, and 93 buildings. And it consumed somewhere around 700 million gallons of water a day.
Yeah, and one of Henry Ford's obsessions was to actually place all of his new factories on rivers because of his sort of view that they were critical links to industry, obviously for transportation reasons, but also for cooling and lubrication and things like that would consume so much water, as you just mentioned. And there was a funny anecdote where he was, his company was commissioning the construction of a factory in the Netherlands, and he happened to be on a visit to the site, and he noticed that the plans, or maybe even the early construction, was placed upwards of 2 miles away from the closest waterfront. And he threw up his hands and he basically just said, "No water, no plants," and he canceled the whole thing. And it took some time before they were able to find a suitable location, but eventually they moved it down to the water.
Alex, did you have any comments on River Rouge? I know you were pretty interested in some of his later manufacturing stuff.
Well, I wanted to remind Alex real quick about the kind of effects of a facility like that, and how Henry Ford started thinking in terms of, maybe this mass industrialization of society isn't necessarily good for the soul, and he starts sponsoring things like camping trips and bird watching, as Hans was mentioning. But we were talking about that before, Alex. So anyway, with that, I'll let you take it away.
Sure. So Ford brought about the modern world, but he didn't like it. He didn't like living in it. In a way, he was a simple man. He was a genius at what he did, at business and at engineering, but he didn't like this world that he was creating. As he got older, and the Rouge, once the Rouge was up and running, he spent less and less time there. He had these projects of restoring 18th century villages. So there was one aborted one in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and that was one that he finished called Greenfield Village in Michigan, where he had these historic buildings restored. He had working farms, which he would work himself using pre-industrial technology. And late in life, he didn't even want to hear about the factory. It seemed at times he would go and work the fields, and have a big outdoor lunch and play at Gentleman Farmer.
He was almost something of a nascent traditionalist.
Yeah.
On balance, I'll ask you guys, do you think that Henry Ford deserves responsibility for kind of the mass consumption / production society we live in the sense that it maybe wasn't a good thing?
No, I don't think that that's how it works. I think that a man is born into a time, and if he has certain gifts and certain proclivities, and he fulfills that destiny, his own personal destiny, it might very well find itself on the wrong end of a historical cycle, so to speak. You may your talents. I mean, just as an analogy, take someone who's born to be a soldier, that's what they are. Well, they may find themselves fighting in an unjust war. I mean, Ford, in another possible vision of modernity, in another sort of a futurist version, where you could have elements of the traditional order preserved and also be able to sustain culturally in the health of your society, sustain the advent of things like speed and industry. I mean, this is effectively what fascism was trying to achieve, as a merger between these things. And I think that Ford put in a different context that wasn't America and its tragic destiny with the modern world. I think that the counterfactual would have been very positive. I think that you need Promethean figures but I don't think that he was responsible for it. I think that modernity was happening and he played his hand in it because that was his sort of his personal destiny. But no, I don't believe he has a moral responsibility for what goes wrong, what has gone wrong, and what was bound to have gone wrong with modernity in America.
I don't know if he deserves blame or scorn. I think Henry Ford, in particular once the Depression started, and he had this complaint throughout the 20s, the Roaring 20s, that something was being lost amongst sort of the shrewdness and the cleverness of the American, even the working or the poor class in the United States had this shrewd intelligence to them, he felt. And I think that he saw that more as a deterministic factor in sort of the eventual decline of society, that the texture of society was changing, that it wasn't so much the problem with having heavy industry, but it was what was going on socially that it bothered him the most. And I think that Ford would say, if he was around now and could examine history for the last 80 years or 90 years in full, he would say that it wasn't really him that brought this on, but he played his part, as Nick was saying. But unfortunately, played his part at a time when social attitudes changed so rapidly, so fast. But I know Alex had something he wanted to say on the subject.
Sure. These forces are just, they're bigger than any one man. And these changes were going to happen with or without Ford.
Yes, that's my
reading his comments on modern life actually reminded me of this essay, The Hind Tit, by Andrew Little, which is about the destruction of the yeoman farmer in America, about how by integrating into the economy, you lose that you lose the lifestyle, the fabric of the community, the family, your daily routine, the meaningful, the sense of the feeling you get from your day's work, from a meal that comes from your farm. And I think they both were aware of the role that the government taxation on the farmer played, that banking played, and just the temptations of modern life. As soon as every farmer has a tractor, you're then competing on efficiency. You're working for the cash crop above all, as opposed to subsistence crops. When you have, newspapers, magazines, radio, Hollywood, your kids, your wife want, all the they start to want things that you may not be able to afford without credit. And then actually you can see how farmers got into trouble with debt going into the Depression. Credit became very easy under the Federal Reserve System, and it was hard for people to resist. Ford talks a lot about how it's not hard to take out a loan. The bankers are always there, and it's a trap that you can get into as a businessman or as a farmer. So it's I don't know what the answer is. Ford had this fantasy of workers spending the winter months in a factory and the summer months on the farm, but it's hard to see how it could work. And we're still grappling with this today, with obesity and mental illness, and just
this reminds me of a few of you mentioned, the Adam Smith being kind of this almost idealistic figure of what capitalism could represent to a society, and I would agree that Henry Ford was very similar in that sense, that if only you all behaved yourselves and you lived the way you're supposed to, we could have a wonderful society. But I don't know if we can excuse his, kind of boyish naivete, given how much power he had. And I will give him credit for at least caring. Most people don't even care. He was observant of the fact that there were some negative changes brought about by this society that he did help create. Now, I won't pin the blame on him, because obviously there are many others that were taking part in this. And I will give him credit for the fact that he actually tried to steer it in a good direction, even though those efforts were largely probably not very effective, at least in the long run. But it really is sort of true when you look back at how America has changed from the kind of rugged individual yeoman farmer of, all a man needs is, a plot of land and, leave me alone and I'm good. Where it's become this very industrialized, centralized, and specialized economy where everything is integrated, and you really have no choice but to participate in it if you want to eat, or if you want to be somewhat independent and not be dependent on a welfare handout. You can't really go off on your own anymore. And I think it lends the system that the industrialized system lends itself to a very corrupting centralization of power that allowed countries like the United States and the Soviet Union to turn into the war machines that they essentially became during the 20th century, with all of the manufacturing power that they could harness all at once, as we've seen in both the first, second world wars and later in the Cold War.
It was the advent of the technocratic managerial elite and the immense power at their disposal that came with the Pandora's box of industry. And I would credit Ford in the sense that when he looked on this world situation, he tried to see his way through the light, whereas other men from the elite had a much darker and perverse vision that we are unfortunately living through today. And of course, I'm referring to men like Aldous Huxley, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells. And this, it's not coincidental either that this is sort of an infatuation of the Anglophilic, as I mentioned earlier, the Anglophilic Atlanticist class, whereas Henry was looking towards the Prussian and German order of things, where this was this mercantile technocratic push for world domination. and he didn't see it that way. And we can think, there's an element of his character in there, because that was where the pressures would have been to be in line with those people. And unfortunately, one area in which we can, I don't know if it's about morally faulting. I try not to play that game too much with history, but it is worth noting the tragedy of his legacy, of where his money and his personal family legacy went. His resources, his wealth was turned into the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation is sort of archetypical of the perverse deep state enemy of relationship between intelligence and private money power.
Let's talk about that a little bit during his sort of legacy after he dies. I want to touch upon World War II, though. You mentioned how his sort of wealth and power was used.
I have a comment on, while we're talking about sort of the philosophy of his life. I think that Henry Ford was a true inheritor of the land-based aristocracy that built America. And in a lot of ways, he was a walking hybrid of both Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And I think that much of his life and much of his anger as the 20s raged on, as the Depression enveloped, was that this is derived from his Hamilton side growing. And so things like the River Rouge, before he saw it in its completion and began to hate it and retreated to this Jeffersonian side of a small yeoman farmer republic,
the bucolic vision.
Yeah, he got lost in the Hamiltonian vision of trying to do whatever necessary to optimize conditions on the micro level and the macro level for manufacturing and building America. And when he saw what his work was bringing upon the world, and he saw the forces of history coalescing, I think that the Hamiltonian side of Henry Ford died. And it died like right after he finished the V8 engine. So effectively, the last two inventions that Henry Ford played a huge role in were the Model A, the new Model A in 1928, and the V8 engine, which revolutionized engine power going forward for mostly American muscle cars in 1932. And past that point, and to what Alex said, he retreated to Greenfield. He retreated away from his immense, almost Promethean accomplishments, and tried to live life like Thomas Jefferson, a sort of conservative Renaissance man who lived off the land and thought about the ways of natural law and how it pertained to America and what needed to be done to keep America the way it used to be. And ultimately, I think he saw he was failing when he became worse in health, and he saw the company's shares declining and the company's market power declining. And I think that going into World War II, he was sort of a tragic, bitter figure, and he had lost much of the drive that once sort of animated him.
Well, as much of the European world did. I mean, all the dreams and all the horizons were, in my view, destroyed with that war.
Yeah.
That was the end of a potentially positive synthesis between a continuation of the culture, of the blood, and of industry and creation of the Promethean fire. It ended with that because the world came into the control of that other group of people, the technocratic elite, the people who saw men as ants to be serviced in their great machine, and not as ends in themselves, as participants in the body of culture and of the life of the people.
What'd you have on World War II, Adam?
Well, I don't want to get caught up in the details. That's a huge topic. I sort of have a summary.
We in general avoid because it is such a rabbit hole. It's like World War II is the thing that it's like the shadow that hovers over our show.
No,
listeners, eventually we will get to the big one.
Yeah, I think we'll have to break it up. But
it's going to
just
take some time.
from the context of Ford, he was getting old, and he basically was in the process of bringing his son into the company. Now, he never really gave his son very much room to become his own man, and that relationship is actually very telling about Henry Ford the man and where his talents lay and how he viewed the world. But during World War II, the Ford Motor Company did play an important role this is the sort of war propaganda you could say about how America spun the Ford Company's involvement, but Detroit became what became known as the arsenal of democracy, and Ford played a major role in that.
Yeah. Bleach.
Yeah, we're gonna bomb you into democracy, right? So, isn't that what America has been doing ever since? But I mean, shit, you could argue Wilson was doing that, but for 100 years now. But Ford most interestingly became involved in the aircraft business. Obviously, Ford Motor Company is a car company, but Ford had actually some experience designing aircraft prior to the war, and that was probably why he got the contracts to do the work at Willow Run, which was the main factory responsible for producing the B-24 Liberator bomber. Again, there's another nice name for it, the Liberator, which was used to bomb the hell out of Europe.
Daily reminder, as Ezra Pound said, democracy just means a country controlled by Jews.
You should have just named it Democracy Now! Or some stupid name. Like Liberators doesn't get the point across enough.
Yeah, it's kind of a goofy looking plane too, but nonetheless, the Ford Motor Company was making these, and they actually had, I believe, some facilities down in other states outside of Michigan, but I don't want to speak too far off the main topic of kind of what this time of Henry Ford's life was really like to him. He didn't seem to display the same zeal he had displayed during the First World War, and that he wanted peace. I don't think he felt like he had the energy or the ability to really affect any change.
He was for a time on the board of the America First Committee.
Sure,
and he was removed.
Charles Lindbergh and him were probably on pretty good terms. I do believe they were in communication, at least. Who was a major figure of the America First movement, I believe.
Right.
I think his earlier struggle burnt him out.
I think so, yeah. And just his later years of life and ill health, I think he just kind of gave up. No, but I totally agree with that. That's my main sort of observation about him, because he just wasn't his own man anymore. The company was so big, and he was so old that, and the country had changed so much, and the forces that were controlling it had moved things in such a direction that I don't think he felt like he could put up a fight. So he didn't really do anything to resist, and obviously the company was actively involved in the war effort, and like every other company, I mean, there really wasn't any choice. America had become a command economy. There actually was no, get this, there may have been a few, exceptions, but there was, to my knowledge, no civilian production of automobiles during that war, or at least during America's involvement since 1941. And so after the war, there was actually a huge pent-up demand, and that was one of the reasons why the Detroit of the 1950s was such a nice place to live, because there was this just enormous demand for peacetime goods that the country had not felt satiated during not only World War II, but the Depression. And I'll make one more comment about World War II. What World War II did to the American economy as a whole, I would say, but also in Ford's case in particular, and also the other automakers, was that the Depression had really left a lot of doubts in people's minds about the ability of free market capitalism to keep society in a healthy state with with full employment and people generally prosperous and happy. And the Depression really forced many people to do a lot of soul searching philosophically, as well as just grappling with more materialistic concerns like finding food. And what World War II did was it essentially erased all unemployment in the country. I mean, dealing with a labor surplus,
through slave conscription,
essentially. No, it's essentially that's right. People didn't have a choice; they had to go to work. But what that did was that gave the major corporations who had not previously perhaps participated in the wartime economy a taste for what government contracts could represent. And subsequently, the Ford Motor Company involved itself in a minor way, compared to other automakers and manufacturing companies. They involved themselves nonetheless in the Philco electronics company, which they bought in order to get in on the military contracting of the military-industrial complex fame. And this changed the nature of the country. I mean, World War II brought about so much power, in addition to what the Depression had done, to Washington, D.C., and the country has never changed. I mean, the country has never looked the same, I should say, since then. It's really revolved. A major part of America's economy has revolved ever since around military production, and it still represents, the aerospace industry in particular is still a major chunk of the U.S. economy. And you could argue that's a good thing. I mean, that there's, some industrial policy there that maybe keeps people employed and keeps the country on a leading edge of something. But I would
not argue.
No, I know you wouldn't. I'm just sort of painting out the arguments people will make. And I would say the full evil of the war machine came to full bore in the Vietnam War, where it just was, there really was no national interest at all to be involved in that country.
One writer described it as the techno war.
Yeah,
I forget his name, but there's some interesting interviews with him.
Well, interestingly enough, the person who was in charge of John F. Kennedy's Defense Department, I think later Lyndon Johnson's as well, Defense Secretary, was Robert McNamara, and Robert McNamara was a Ford Motor Company alum, and he actually was the president of the company for 1 month until Kennedy called him to come serve in the White House. And he was the technocrat. He believed that it was essentially
the arch technocrat.
Yeah, it was essentially a war. The Vietnam War was essentially a war of numbers, and if you could kill enough Vietnamese, they would give up. And he basically was measuring everything that way.
He got his start in World War II with bombing pattern, like the fire bombing of Tokyo, and trying to ensure maximum casualties.
Yeah,
and so he was a war technocrat from the beginning. And there's an interesting the Jew Errol Morris did a very interesting documentary interview with him before he died a few years ago. I forget the Fog of War, it was called. Highly recommend that.
Yeah, excellent. I've seen that. Yeah, it's. I recommend it as well. It's excellent. It's about Robert McNamara and his
yeah, he also did a follow-up in the same vein with Rumsfeld a couple years later. And that there highlights this irony again, that it's like, in many ways you could speculate. A man like Ford certainly could not come about now because the field is set, right? I mean, you couldn't have an independent figure like this. I mean, all these firms, like you're discussing, they're now inextricably intertwined with the military industrial complex, the intelligence services, and things like this. And as a prelude, we will get around to doing an episode on Howard Hughes as well, and we'll see that Howard Hughes is far more of a victim of this kind of situation than Ford ever was, because he came about in the post-war. He was dealing much longer into the post-war era, where you're basically you're a servant of the Pentagon one way or the other, and the people who run the Pentagon. Yeah, Hans, you had something?
Well, I think we should try to bring this to a rough close with the closing of World War II in 1945. This was And before I should mention, I think Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's only child, I think he passed away in, was it 43? Maybe you guys can correct me on the exact dates. But Henry Ford did outlive him. And
Yeah, it was 43.
yeah, and it was
Wasn't there a Henry Ford II?
that's who succeeded Henry Ford, but the son of Henry was Edsel, and he passed away in 43. And it's sort of very tragic in that the relationship that the father and son had was not exactly an easygoing one, especially given that they probably were not expecting this, and it was probably didn't give the two of them a good chance to reconcile very well. But without going into too much of the details, which is an interesting story unto itself, Edsel Ford died in 43, and it left the company in a big question as to succession. And so when Henry Ford died in 47, it was passed over, the control of the company was passed over to Henry Ford II, who was Edsel's son. And I think what's interesting about that, and Hans, you had requested we talk about the labor movement. What I think to bridge these two, the contrast between Edsel and Henry Ford II are very interesting. They're all very unique individuals. Edsel was always very much in his father's shadow, and he wanted to make his father proud of him, and he never really could accomplish that, much to the chagrin of Henry Ford's wife, Clara, who loved her son and wanted to see him have given more responsibility. Nonetheless, it just wasn't something that Henry trusted him with, and so when he died, it was not. In the long run, they had expected maybe Henry Ford II to take over at some point, but they had not laid out the education for him at the company to do so. And so when he was thrust into the role in 47, he took on a very different character to Henry Ford's. So Henry Ford, I'll paraphrase it, but he had said something to the effect that labor unions were the worst thing to ever be invented. And funnily enough, he actually accused the bankers of creating them, which is probably not very accurate, but nonetheless he did. And he really genuinely hated the concept because he felt like, well, if I'm doing a good enough job, and I'm clearly doing a lot more than the others in this respect, the workers should appreciate that. But during the Depression and during the war, there were a lot of strikes, and there was also a lot of communist agitation and idealism in the air, and they had to contend with this. And so Henry Ford actually had to agree at one point to giving the UAW the rights to have some representation. And Henry Ford II brought it to a new level after the war, in which he was a very hard worker, and nobody faults him for this, but he actually was much, much more receptive to the concept of a labor movement, and some even went so far as to call him a liberal. And in the later years, during the 60s and during the race riots, he found a lot of friends with the kind of jet set crowd and people like Martin Luther King. And so some people could probably interpret this very much like a lot of people see somebody like Ivanka Trump. I mean, she hangs out with these liberals in New York, and she's got a lot to prove because she's inherited a lot of her family's money, and she hasn't earned it herself. And so I think one of the common instincts for a wealthy heir is to want to appease the public so that they don't receive the hatred and jealousy that is probably thrown at them otherwise. And I think Henry Ford II was probably operating under similar motivations.
Edsel's son, Henry's grandson.
Right, the second, yeah. And the other characteristic about him that is just in accordance with this jet set concept is that he was literally involving the company in things that Henry Ford would never really find very important. I mean, I'll sort of put the caveat that he did become famous for building a race car, but the the Model T is really, to me, what encapsulates Henry Ford's philosophy of, car for the everyman. And in the 60s, the United States was just starting to face competition from imports. And Europe was especially desperate after the devastation of the war. And so they wanted to get those American dollars. And so they were looking to export. And they started selling these kind of boutique, sleek cars, the Aston Martins, the Ferraris, and the Volkswagen Beetle was actually a huge hit as well, which, by the way, we should mention was inspired. The whole company, the Wolfsburg plant was set up by Hitler in direct emulation of the Ford model for Germany.
It was a social national car.
Right. And the Beetle was designed by Ferdinand Porsche, who did Porsche, obviously. And that design was a huge hit in America. And so Henry Ford II was starting to notice this, and he started to hang out with these people, and he was, getting on the airplanes, and he even actually ended up divorcing his wife and marrying a Italian princess, which was very scandalous for a conservative Midwesterner to do. And he found himself getting involved in auto racing, and they ended up winning Le Mans, and this was actually a pretty big marketing coup for the company. I don't know how much we want to go into post Henry Ford's life, but I just wanted to kind of set it up there and talk about the labor change.
The GT40 was a beautiful car.
Oh, it still is. They really released it, I think, in the early 2000s, and you can still get it.
There's some pretty funny episodes of Top Gear where Jeremy ended up buying it. And in keeping with departure from his father's legacy, I mean, you had the Ford under Henry II. You had the Ford Foundation become what it is today, which is, as I was mentioning earlier, an insidious globalist. I mean, some of these archetypical globalist institutions, all bound up with the intelligence services and the general degeneracy, culture poisoning degeneracy. I mean, the Ford Foundation funded things like the Kinsey Research. I mean, we could do a whole episode on these NGOs. Here, people like Alex Jones will mention these things, Ford Foundation. Well, it's true. I mean, we know this is true, and it's a sad thing to see where the possibilities of American industry and kind of the possibility of another elite, a different kind of elite that served the people, the actual people, and they devoted their energies and their industry into the nation, the actual people, as opposed to what it's become, which the world technocratic state, and all these resources and the dreams and ideas of these men are perverted and twisted into some kind of new world order. Sad.